Yeah, I do, man. I've always been really excited. Like when I have to do presentations for uni, it's like one of the most exciting things to me because it's like, yes, I get to talk for 40 minutes non-stop and no one can interrupt me. And I got really disappointed because last week I had a presentation. I was on Islam and feminism, yeah. And obviously that's something that we've spoken about a lot on the podcast and during lockdown, like every night on Clubhouse, there seemed to be a discussion that revolved around the same dot points. So all this stuff was fresh in my head and I came out there and obviously I know more than the rest of the class about Islamic epistemology.
Yeah.
And usul and madahib and how like classical positions within Sunni Islam are constructed and preserved. So I'm giving this whole like thorough breakdown.
Just to press on that a little bit, have you found people in your class and their views on Islam, are they very like hell-bent extreme feminists, or they're pretty balanced and try to appreciate, I guess, what traditional Islam has to offer and I guess mold their feminism according to, you know, the principles within Islam, which is essentially like, I guess, what we try to do. But would you say they have that level of appreciation in doing that?
Pretty much everyone in the class is not Muslim. So it's really interesting that they've all shared pretty much the discussions that they've had with their families, that when they've mentioned that they're studying the relationship between Islam and feminism at uni, everyone in their family goes, how can such a thing exist? And it plays into the idea, you know, of like Islam being the most misogynistic, the most misogynistic tradition, that like how could someone possibly come up with ideas of emancipation for women within the sort of Islamic context, because it's so obviously wrong. And so most of the people in the class, I mean, there are a couple of Muslims. The professor's not Muslim. She's Italian. She studied at the University of Venice. She speaks fluent Arabic though, like her Arabic's like native. So she's a decent scholar. I would say so. And I think other academics who I've asked about her, Muslim academics who I've asked about her, have been like, nah, she's like a good scholar. But it's sort of precarious because when you're studying Islam and obviously Islam in a gender, like an idea of gender emancipation, female emancipation and gender in a Western context, there are obviously going to be things that are unique to our kind of cultural sort of outlooks on women and gender. So I have found that at times there is a push towards a sort of liberalization, and that things like women taking off the hijab at times in countries where, you know, this is seen as a feminist thing, and the resistance, for example, in Iran to force hijab, that is seen positively and like portrayed positively.
Yeah, in feminist circles you're talking about.
Yeah. And whilst it's not so cut and dry, and I think like you've said before, I think we should probably avoid talking about it so much because it might incur the ires of some who feel us to be unqualified to speak on feminism and matters relating to it. No, which is fair. And I would say though that if I were to impart sort of one summarizing sentence, it would be that it's just complex, man. Like you can't really describe the relationship between something so broad as feminism and something so broad as Islam without really defining every single thing. And then those debates are going to be ongoing and they're going to overlap when you're even just defining what these words mean.
Yeah.
So if someone asks you, like, this was my conclusion in the book, it's like if someone asks you, like, can you have an Islamic feminist? Is such a thing a juxtaposition? There are so many debates. It's like, well, yeah, like to what extent can you appropriate feminism according to the context like that? Acknowledges something such as qawama or mahrams, right? So
yeah, some feminists may find that problematic, but obviously the ones that are kind of epistemology is Islamic and Muslim, they wouldn't.
What's really fascinating though that we did learn is that a lot of women who came out and termed themselves Islamic feminists in the 80s and 90s actually rescinded that label and then later referred to themselves as Muslimas. They didn't actually keep the label feminist into the 21st century. And the reason for that was they basically said, well, look, we don't need to necessarily say that we're feminists in order to strive for women's rights in Islam. And again, their point was that Islam was fundamentally positive for women and beneficial for women. And that within Muslim societies, if you strive for the rights that the Prophet ﷺ gave women in Medina, then that would be sufficient. And they didn't want, not just that they didn't feel that feminism was Islamic or un-Islamic, rather they didn't want to be they didn't want the negative press. And within their Muslim societies, they didn't want to be criticized as feminists. Because obviously the term feminist and feminist activism in the Muslim world carries connotations of being a Western liberal, right? And unfortunately, because of like the conflicts with, the West, for example, in Afghanistan, one scholar, Valentin Muqaddam, talks about how the invasion of the Soviets and the involvement of the West has obscured the very important indigenous discussions amongst Afghan women. So, for example, discussions amongst Afghan women about the extent to which Pashtun tribal law is discriminatory against women in a way that the Quran would not approve of. But then, if you start having that conversation about improving women's rights in the context of Soviet atheist intrusion and then later Western intrusion, people who are arguing in defense of this conservative law, quote unquote, are going to be able to use the fact that you're acting as a proxy for foreigners against you.
Yeah, like weaponizing the situation
exactly.
to their agenda. And that's like a huge problem, right? And I assume with Muslim feminists who rescinded their label of calling themselves feminists later, they didn't feel like when they were in those feminist spaces that they were really, truly being understood and represented. And so essentially, like, I assume as well, it comes like, I guess, with the tussle between white feminists versus like Asian, contemporary Asian feminists.
Yeah, exactly.
There's that level of disconnect, and they, the Asian feminists truly never felt, that the white feminists understood the struggle. It's only seen through, the white gaze, and so essentially, it's like I can never really be understood in these spaces. And I actually read, it was I forgot an Aileen Moreton. It's like an Aboriginal, very famous. I forgot the name, skipping my mind. But uni, I basically did read their books, and so read their texts as well. And so essentially, one thing that they noted was when essentially the white feminists were there, fighting for their own sort of rights. Aboriginal feminists did not feel welcomed or appreciated in those circles because they had a very distinct, different struggle, right? Obviously. And so for them, it's like they could never ever be in those spaces and never really be understood. And so essentially that to sort of, find their own spaces in order to make their sort of issues heard because they were not really heard by the white. So like that's what I mean. Like even like you're talking about the specific point about Muslim feminists, later, not feeling welcomed in those spaces and all that kind of conversation. But it's not exclusive to Islam. You get what I'm saying? It's also happening to, colored women or different women of different faiths. And so I think this actually flows into, this is a good discussion. Like this kind of goes into a broader point about like fields such as like critical race theory that gets talked about a lot. And it's like, we have Islam, why this and that. But it's like, at the end of the day, and this is like, and the very recent episode we did with Yasser Morsi made a really, really powerful point in that episode. He's just like, identity politics is a reaction to liberalism because liberalism assumes universality, and so it's imposed all on us. So like, for example, in the Islamic tradition, it was really beautiful. I forgot, like, I was watching watching a lecture. Reading a lecture.
Bro, you see
I'm on a different maqam, bro.
Now,
I'm on a different maqam.
SubhanAllah, man.
Reading a lecture.
Maqam, bro.
But yeah, anyway, so like
something green, maybe something a bit spicy that you've inhaled, maybe.
So like within the Islamic tradition, right? We have that kind of multifaceted approach. We have, the four madhabs, or especially in how the Mughals ruled. There's so many different languages and people within that region, and we were able to, subhanallah, able to, successfully like rule those lands, right? And that's like something to really be proud of, in the sense that Islam has that power to have that almost, I don't know if the right word's like fluidity, or that kind of ability to, even like we know within the Islamic tradition, like if there's a Jewish community within, Islamic State. It's like they can rule by their own law, and this is what happened in Medina, right? That was like one of the things, like the Jewish people can rule according to their own law amongst their own people. But if they wanted to, delegate an issue to, the Muslim ruler at that time, they can do that in specific issues, but they can kind of go use their own within the sort of Islamic State. So it gives them that flexibility to, rule according to their own law, right? And so within liberalism, we don't have that option. We'll succumb to the law that's put upon us, right? So it's a very, almost forced down our throat, right? Especially like many different, situations, like it could be inheritance, divorce, and, marriage, and how it navigate all that. It's like, we know this, it's different, right? For Muslims, right? We can't just like rule by our own law and not kind of, somehow avoid
even, okay, think about this, yeah. You're not allowed to do anything according to your own law in a liberal society. But if you do it in your own Muslim society, they will come to your country and they will destroy your government. Like, you're not even allowed to do it in your own land.
Yeah.
It's an imperial force, man. Like, Western liberalism is an imperial force,
exactly,
with an army backing it.
Yeah, pretty much. And so essentially when it comes to when it comes to like liberalism, the reaction to liberalism is identity politics. That's why we see like, liberalism doesn't represent us or how we want to do things. It doesn't facilitate our own, struggles and the way we see the world. It's only according to how the white people see the world, and it's being forced upon us and how we should be viewed, etc. Right? And so that's what I mean. It's not just like exclusive to Islam. Like, if you can kind of make your critique more sophisticated and wider if you actually look to and see for yourselves other communities that are undergoing struggles and oppressions, etc. Because at the end of the day, we know within Islam, right, we have to stand for justice, truth, etc. Right? And so even if, for example, there's other communities that obviously they're not Muslim, but that does not mean we just suddenly like, I don't know, we just disregard them and we only talk about the quote unquote Muslims community, right? Because at the end of the day, Islam stands for truth, justice. So we have to actually look into other communities that are also struggling and also, oppressed, etc., and sort of understand their plan. You'll see so many parallels. There's so many parallels. So it's like you sort of your argumentation becomes even more sophisticated and broader, right? And understanding. And I guess for me, that's what happened with like feminism. Understanding that really opened my eyes. Instead of seeing it as feminism come to destroy Muslim man or something, and how Islam does things, it's like,
yeah, no, that's it.
Way more wider than
absolutely. And that's not to say, like, at the same time, you can't have Islamic articulations of a critique of any kind of movement or ideology, right? You can have, there might exist genuine sort of Islamically oriented critiques of something like critical theory, right? I have not seen it yet, but we're not denying the possibility of such a thing. I'm not denying the possibility of Islamic articulations of an argument or a sort of polemic against certain elements within feminism. Like, it's not to say that, right? It's simply to say that what has been touched upon so many times before on this podcast, like, and it's fresh on my mind because of studying it recently. It's so much more complex, and none of the articulations that we currently have at a community level, even amongst people who are considered to be intellectuals in the community, right? None of them seem to have really done justice to the subjects. And
I agree.
Anyone who really does is sort of labeled as sort of a deviant in a way, right? Someone who sheds complexities onto sheds complexities upon these realities, these sociological realities, will sort of be cast aside as a Looney Tune liberal, which is hilarious, right? Because
and it's equated to being gay, right? Like, that's how I see. Like, that's why identity politics equals being homosexual, and it's haram.
And you have to dye your hair pink and get like a nose piercing. And but why do they call liberals, right? Do you know what I mean? Like, CRT and they're obviously critiques of liberalism.
Yeah.
But then, like, in the North America...
That's like, you can use that as a Muslim.
Bro, they get everything wrong up there, man, in North America. Like, they get use
it as your weapon, right? But then it's like, oh, no, we're going to critique that. I'm like, then what are you standing for? Are you like a liberal yourself? I don't understand. Like, you know what I mean?
Bro, I think that question there at the end was maybe a little bit more profound than we might realize. Like, are you a liberal yourself?
Exactly. That's right.
Like, I think you are, man. There's a lot of that, isn't there? Especially with the way that a lot of them are so anxious to shift conversations towards personal responsibility. Like we talked about this, yeah? So you know how in this dichotomy in the community now, there seems to be the emergence of the personal responsibility camp and the sort of critical theory camp.
Yeah.
The structural
versus
influence.
agency.
Yeah, agency. So we've seen this. And then within that, there seems to be this like anxiety, potentially from both sides, to refute the other entirely. But obviously, and I think this is something that our ulama historically understood, both are real. You know, like the actual conditions in a political conditions have an impact on people.
Of course.
Likewise, people's decisions, people's free will and their intellect is something that Allah will, the use of which is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will judge you for in Yawm al-Qiyamah. Like, you believe that, right?
Yeah. You know, we were having this conversation with Josh about education rates and getting a university degree. Were you there in the car? We were talking
Mad
about...
invite, bro, if I wasn't. Like,
You were there. I don't know if we dropped you off about this conversation, but it was like the statistics show like you're more than likely to get a university degree if your parents have done
oh
it.
yeah, I did say that.
Yeah.
'Cause that was
So
fresh
what
on
was
my
it,
mind.
like the stats are like insane, right?
No,
like,
I just
it's a
said the
big
biggest predictor of education is your parents' level of education.
So that's a very like, it's like, how can you just go to someone and be like, oh, personal responsibility, bro? Like, you know what I mean? Like there's other factors in play when it comes to especially someone like becoming educated, right? And it's about taking that into consideration. Like even for me, when I'm studying like history, for example, it's like, of course, within the Islamic tradition, it's like, you know, you do the effort, tie your camel and do as much as you can. And, you know, not being lazy is an emphasize. Like I agree with all of that. Like I don't think that's even the conversation, right? It's about actually factoring the structural issues within society. And we know within like, I guess, from the context of the caliph and trying to do the best for, you know, the people or the Muslims, it's like they try to do as much as they can from their kind of angle. And that part is also important, right? In terms of, you know, fixing issues within the society and the community, right? Like there's no doubt that plays like a big role as well, right?
Yeah, of course, man. Of course it does. No doubt. Because ultimately as well, I think to add on to that, you have to understand that potentially your articulation of truth, so whether or not you decide to explore reality that you're living in and try and come up with a pragmatic solution to overcome it fi sabilillah and for the sake of the ummah, i.e. you come up with a sustained and thoughtful critique of the condition of Muslims and perhaps of the enemies, like of the kuffar, right? You criticize them. Is that not also like a personal endeavor to strive, like a personal striving that is not like contradictory in any way with the idea of like personal responsibility versus agency? So like to explain what I mean, I'm saying ultimately that maybe you studying these things, you studying this is part of something that is eternally beneficial and something that is part of the good of like enjoining the good and forbidding the evil, right? That's such an obvious thing. Why wouldn't it be? And why would it not be considered if you go to study like in depth, if you go to understand what the ummah, like what has befallen the ummah and the condition of the ummah presently, and you devote your life to studying and explaining that to other Muslims, right? That's something profound, and that's something that is using your own personal agency to overcome your condition. And it's even better than just personally, you know, let's not talk about structural issues, let's just get a job and go to the gym. And I mean, that was a terrible, that wasn't very nice of me there, because that's not all that's happening. But not all people who believe in CRT have blue hair and nose piercings too. So, you know, we're guilty on both sides.
This is good convo, and because of like, I guess all our stuff, because we've been doing, you know, sort of sessions together in terms of like 4 temperaments and all that, and, you know, love languages and all that. And so how about the idea about, because we know as human beings, we are, I guess, put it kind of bluntly, or, you know, in a reductionist sense, like we're almost programmed to behave in a certain way because of our temperament. Like we're inclined towards a certain behavior because of our temperament, right? And so I guess within that project in of itself, it's like we have unconscious actions that we do as a result of our temperament. And so as a result, it's like it's important for us to be, self-aware and understanding of our sort of unconscious behaviors in order to, not fall into problematic behaviors, right? So like one example can be, especially in a family environment, if someone was a sanguine, right? And they didn't get the positive affirmation they needed, right? And so naturally they seek out that kind of positive affirmation from others, and that may lead to, haram potentially down the track, because, they may seek it from, the opposite gender in a relationship, yada, yada. So it can one lead to another, right? And so there are also these issues that we need to be aware of. And do you find that within activist circles that these conversations are also missing? Because it's important, because, okay, there's one point, obviously, structure and all that, which is really important. I don't think anyone denies that, because at the end of the day, you can kind of analyze the stats and the data, and it's pretty clear what the issues or how they rise about, right? You can see that kind of correlation. And so you can kind of, if you have the, influence and, if you can kind of, put in the money in the right areas and do the right things, you can kind of, fix those issues, right? And at the same time, though, it's not like we can kind of fix the issues of the sort of, psychological ones that I just discussed about, unconscious behaviors that may lead down a certain path that might be destructive, right? So how do you would you say that is also a big issue?
So you're asking if in circles of like political activism in particular and activist circles, whether or not there is a sort of extremity in their rejection or their suspicion of noting the kind of personal psychological influences and their importance in determining action and behavior. Yeah, of course. I think I mentioned that, like how there's this polarization that occurs and the schism that occurs where we make like both of the camps that have emerged between the kind of, as they've been coined recently, the neo-trads or the trads, right? The traditionalists who tend to emphasize what, you've mentioned in terms of personal psychological and personal spiritual impediments. And then on the other hand, you have the people who are concerned with critiquing societal and external factors. So what happens though is there's a caricaturing of each side, wherein, people associated with the activists could very easily accuse someone of trying to ignore or shirk the external realities if they so much as try to start a conversation centering the personal psychological and the like psycho-spiritual, maybe is a word. That happens, no doubt, man.
Yeah, because I think that is also something to take, because I think when it comes to activism, there's that fixation on, like, obviously in terms of oppression, whatever wrong that happens in front of us, right? We speak out against it and it's part of the tradition. So I don't even argue with that point. But people sometimes utilize, or within the field of activism, what happens is people actually go into those spaces as a result of their trauma. Does that make sense? Yeah. Which isn't a bad thing, because it's like you want to seek justice. But at the same time, it can manifest in a more destructive manner, especially if, for example, things are being judged only by the surface level, but not by the deeper layers to a human being, especially when it comes to, I don't know, someone speaking out or saying something. Like one simple example that came to my mind is like Omar Suleiman and the Yaqeen Institute situation. This isn't like technically activism, but it's just an example, right? I think there was that kind of... he put water on something and there was a big outcry or some pagan ritual or something. Like obviously what he did was wrong, right? Like in the sense of like partaking in that. But obviously I don't think anyone said it's like kind of non-takfir him or anything to that effect. But it's like in the same breath, it's like you can tell the character of what Omar Suleiman is. And it's not like it's in his kind of nature to be, I don't know. Like in that environment, a lot of people just kind of go with the flow, if that makes sense. So it's not like I'm going to judge based on that action in of itself, right? I'm going to try to understand the human being and the person beneath that, but not trying to justify his behavior. But point is like I'm just using that example. I don't know how. That's probably not the right example. Because we love Almost Suleiman anyway.
Every action is according to the intention as well.
Yeah, exactly. So then, taking that example, I'm just talking about in a different situation where it's like people are judging based on the action on the surface level, but it's like there's inner workings underneath that needs to be unpacked and discussed. But people are too quick to jump onto what's seen as the external, right? And I think that in of itself is an issue, because that doesn't really hit home in terms of getting to the crux of,
no, it doesn't, man. You're right, and it's first of all, it's a lack of husnadhan. That occurs on both sides, like we said. Bro, I know, let me tell you, like, personally, I have, on both sides of the divide, the sort of polarization, the two camps, I respect people in both sides. Genuinely. There are people who I respect, and I think, even if I don't agree with, even like a large, even if I don't agree with a great deal of someone's politics, or a great deal of someone's ideas, I genuinely have a sympathy. And I mean, you're talking about how temperament leads you to an inclination to a certain behavior. Perhaps my sympathy is also derived from that as well, right? You know, so obviously I have this sympathy for people, even if I don't agree with them necessarily, because I seek to understand why it is they're saying what they're saying, and whether or not to them it is true, or in their context perhaps it is true. Do you know what I mean? And I think this is something that, like, Dr. Yasser has mentioned as well, about how you have to try and understand the kind of intellectual and genealogy of people to get a grasp of where they're coming from. And that helps you to understand situations. And that's not really happening in these discussions, is it? Like, no one seeks to understand, like, maybe why, either from a personal level or a spiritual level, someone believes or says what they say, do they? But that's, like, so, like, in plain contrast to how we're meant to behave toward one another. Like, it's wrong, man.
Yeah.
You should make excuses for people. You shouldn't be trying to just tabloid style go out here and like,
because they may have
someone.
Stuff that they've been through, and that's why they're behaving in a certain way. But not only that, it's
or
like,
they get roped up in it.
Especially in terms of when it comes to pride, right? There'll be people that will not admit that they're wrong at all. And I think that's more of a behavioral thing. So rather fixating on what they're saying, it should be why they're saying it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so they're only defending what they're saying, even if it's as offensive as you think it is, right? Mm-hmm. They're only saying that because they don't want to be seen as wrong. They have that kind of image in their head of, wanting to have that pride, right? Mm-hmm. And they want to stick by what they're saying and not be proven wrong. And sometimes we fixate too much on what they're saying.
Exactly.
Which is, I think, an issue as well.
Not why they're saying it.
Yeah, and rather, like, we know, like, if someone is acting in fire, the best way is to just be water, right? So I think, like, those sort of approaches aren't being utilized as well in...
I've actually been, like, as you mentioned that, as you know as well, I've told you extensively, and I fear hijacking the rest of this podcast, but I have been, like, deeply engrossed with the life and writing of Ibn Hazm.
Oh, let's talk about that. That was the plan.
Yeah. But I've been so invested in him. And what you're saying, there's actually parallels I can draw to his own life. So he was aware of temperament, for example, and he spoke about it. And he says, in like, translated into English, one of my defects was bad humor. So 4 humors, like temperament, right? And he describes his anger as coming from the yellow bile, excess of yellow bile. So he says, one of my defects was this excess and violent anger, which I have not ceased to combat until I succeeded in suppressing in its external manifestations, namely outbursts of anger in cursing, blows, and attacks on others. I have even suppressed illicit desires of secret vengeance. So he talks about his struggles with anger throughout his life. But then he talks about how important it is to strike a balance, and how sort of this resonates with me. He says, because the biggest, like, the biggest thing launched against Ibn Hazm, was the fact that he was not a very agreeable bloke. This guy literally went around al-Andalus trying to stir up crowds and start fights with people. There was a really funny story, actually, and it reminded me of like the like peak 2000 Salafi days. So, like, basically Ibn Hazm went to the island of Mallorca in Spain, which actually is where, I'm pretty sure that's where Ibiza is now. So it's so weird thinking about, like, this vibrant Islamic scene right now, where, like, the biggest party,
Ibiza, that song.
It's so funny, man. Like when you see these places, you're like, damn, that's like a party capital of Europe now. And then there's just talking about like debates between Maliki scholars there as well. But yeah, so you know what he did, right? And Qadi Iyad talks about this, is he went to Ibiza and he basically like, he would go up to lay people and start like these discussions with lay people, wherein he didn't, Al-Baji Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi talks about it. He says, it proved agreeable to Ibn Hazm to be in the midst of people who had no insight except for certain masail. So they knew only fiqh in terms of like what was established in the madhab, right? So, you know, for example, if you ask me like, Raf, like in the Maliki school, how do you fold your hands? Like, how do you hold your hands when you pray? And I say, we're taught that you hold your hands by your side when you pray. So that's my level of fiqh, yeah? I might not know the dalil. So Ibn Hazm would go to people and go to areas like Mallorca where people weren't really versed in the dalil behind masail. So this is really interesting, right? He liked to go and do that, according to Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi. And he says that he demanded that they produce evidence. And oftentimes they were capable of providing it. So he laughed at them with his friends. So he's basically like going around saying like, hey, so why do you do, because you know Ibn Hazm, for those who don't know, was a famous Zahiri. So he lived in around the 4th century Hijri and 5th century Hijri, and the 10th century in the Common Era, 9th century Common Era in al-Andalus, so modern day Spain. And he was himself of like Spanish descent, so he's a fellow Latin of mine. That's probably why I find so much interest in his life and his maybe a few other analogous aspects that I can get to. But he was basically he was a rich kid from Spain, in Islamic Spain, and his dad was high up in the government, and he was like living a pretty privileged life. He wasn't very religious as a young man, but as he grew into as he got older and became more interested, he rejected all madahib. And he basically became a kind of like, I don't want to say Salafi, but for people to explain it, he's a Zahiri. So he basically decided that only the Quran and the Sunnah could be admitted as evidence for fiqh. He rejected qiyas, he rejected analogical reasoning, and he rejected like ijma'. So he rejected those sources of law. So he only said the Quran and the Sunnah. And then he said, not just only Quran and Sunnah, it has to be the literal meaning of it. So, for example, the famous joke about him is like, you know, the in the Quran, it says, the command is about, the injunction is about, do not say uff to your parents.
Yeah.
Ibn Hazm says, the only prohibition in that ayah is to not say uff to your parents.
Okay.
Do you get it?
Yeah.
That's like a joke, right?
Yeah.
But he's dead serious. Because his point is basically like, why would God make ambiguities in his language when it's a language for all times and places, and it's a guide for all times? He wouldn't do that. So he was very sort of abrasive in his character as well. And I think it's interesting because you could maybe give some insight into this. Yeah. The link between his aggressiveness, his anger, and his like the way he used to sort of either mock, deride people.
That's influencing the way he sees.
The influence of the way he says it's tradition.
Islam,
because he was so determinedly anti-madhab. And I can like show you some of that. I can go point to some of the things and read about like some of the things that he said about madhahib. But he was so scathing. And he was so determined to like destroy madhahib and destroy ulama that they ended up driving him out of all the towns and everywhere he went, and like politicians got involved, and he ended up getting banished to his farm for the rest of his life to live like and just write, because he wasn't welcome anywhere. And all of his opponents and all of the people who remember him, his contemporaries, remember him for just being a really grumpy guy, like a really fundamentally like angry dude who used to fly off the handle, and as he said in his own words, like insult, provoke, mock, and like actually like say things that were like profanity, like the equivalent of swearing at people these days.
Yeah.
And yeah, at the same time, like his approach to the lay people was to, at this point, especially when he was younger, the small anecdote I read was that he would go to them and say like, oh, so why do you do this? Because remember, he was anti-madhab. So he'd be like, oh, why do you do this? And they'd be like, oh, I don't know. Like, my parents taught me. I thought that's just what we did in Islam. And he would laugh. He would just laugh at them with his friends. It's hilarious, man. But yeah, that's it. So that was what was remembered about him. But do you know what? For all that he said about overcoming his anger, and trying to balance his temperament, which he specifically refers to. Like I said, he knew about his temperament. For all that he says about that, in the end, he sort of ends up trying to justify like the way he dealt with things, right? And he does it in a really like poetic and dramatic way. It's very interesting, yeah. So he goes like to the effect of what I'm charged with is being abrasive. So this is what people say about me. Like, one of the things that I'm accused of, the greatest defect that it's launched against me by my ignorant enemies, is saying that when I consider a thing to be true, I don't hesitate to oppose anyone, though it might be the whole inhabitants of the earth, and that I care little to adjust myself to the usages and customs adopted without any reasonable cause by my countrymen. So he's like, look, like people say that my biggest problem is that I don't care about people being wrong. I'll just say, you're wrong. I don't care who you are. I don't care why you do what you do. It's wrong. It's against the Quran and Sunnah. How relevant is this for the day and age that we live in? And then he says, I must say that this quality with which they reproach me is actually my greatest virtue, not to be compared with any of my other qualities. And by my life, I assert that if I did not possess it, that the fact that I did possess this quality is one of the favors which I would desire most to ask of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he's like, this is the thing that I'm most grateful for on earth. Right? And yeah, so he was like really proud of himself, man, for the way that he, in the end, he's like, okay, maybe I shouldn't have been so rude. Maybe I shouldn't have manifested my anger. I shouldn't have been, like getting personally angry about my disputes, because he admits that blows, attacks, outbursts, secret vengeance plans against people, but he basically says, but my anger itself was justified, and the way I was justified, and I don't care if the whole world disagrees with me, I was right. So how interesting is this? Like the personality of Ibn Hazm tied to potentially his and he was a genius as well. There's no need to suffice to say he was definitely a genius. But the personality and maybe the temperament of Ibn Hazm here, by his own admission, had an influence on the way he saw Islam and the madahib.
I think for sure, especially when it comes to scholarship, there needs to be either a primary or secondary sort of fire that is attached to it, or else how are you going to produce those works and be passionate about it and talk about it in such a manner? Especially like you see very prominent scholars, like you need that drive, that natural sort of fire to do all those works and amass that and be, be principled as well, right? Because sometimes in a certain situation, you just need to put your foot down when it comes to certain rulings or how things are going about and standing up for justice, etc. So you can see definitely that. But then what about Ibn Hazm's sort of, love and how he perceived love? Because that's what it's most famous for, right? In some ways.
Man, like, even Western scholars and Orientalists who study him are like, the way he was portrayed early on as like this great lover boy, this romantic dude, like this, the angsty kind of kid that you'd see nowadays with a tumbler who has his hair swept over to one side and talks about like heartbreak and shares that quote what is it? With every hardship comes ease, after every like of his little breakups and stuff like that. Like you get that sort of portrayal of Ibn Hazm in early Orientalist literature. But I don't know where that comes from. And other Orientalist scholars and Muslim scholars as well recently who have been reading this stuff was like, that's not entirely true. Yes, he did talk about love. And I think that he attached a great deal, and he was different from other ulama in the way that he spoke about love. But
sorry, just to add quickly, this is almost fitting to our early conversation about the white gaze, right?
Yeah, that's it. They wanted to portray,
they want to portray in a certain way. They will extract Islam selectively for how they view things and only see it through that lens and not for Islam in of itself. So, sorry.
Exactly, man. You're right. It was that. It definitely was that, because he wasn't like that, bro. He was pretty he was staunch. He was scary. You wouldn't want to confront him in a dark alleyway. He would certainly have some nasty things to say. If you worked with this guy in corporate, you'd watch out for him. He'd be the guy who snitches on you straight away. I mean, a'udhu billah, I don't mean to slander the guy, but he basically said he harbored desires for vengeance on his enemies. So he was very, very truthful. He was scary. And yes, whilst that was a part of his personality, I think it was secondary to his kind of bluntness and truthfulness. It's really interesting too. He talks about how he was overcome by feelings of love, right? But he could never cry. He said basically, I never shed tears in my life. And he talked about that as an affliction. But he did fall in love several times in his life. And obviously he's famous for his treatise on love. Now, people might ask, like, why did this like proto-Salafi, hardcore Zahiri scholar write about love? And he wrote about love in a way that other ulama hadn't written about love. And there's a really interesting difference that's mentioned by one scholar about Ibn Hazm and Ibn Taymiyyah writing about love. So they both wrote about love, yeah? So like Ibn Hazm, Ibn Taymiyyah considers love for like eating, drinking, and women within moderation to be something that's halal, yeah?
Yeah.
Obviously, drinking has to be halal things. Yeah. We don't mean drinking. Only the Bavaria, not the actual beers, the zero alcohol. So, but unlike Ibn Hazm, Ibn Taymiyyah was not interested in different quote unquote accidents of love. So he wasn't actually interested in love of dunya. So like when you hear about love in Islam or ishq in Islam, like what do you think of, right?
What do I personally think
of? What do you think of?
Like love of God, loving God.
Yeah, that's right.
Loving Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Exactly. So Ibn Taymiyyah espouses the view that, okay, whilst all that love is okay, like why would I bother talking about it in detail? Because in his work, he strictly sort of discusses love in terms of finding pleasure in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and in Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So in a way, it's kind of like a little bit Sufi, isn't it? Like, he's like, I don't want to talk about dunyawi love. I want to talk only about the spiritual love, about love for Allah, love for the deen of Allah, and izzah as well, And it was like the result of a sort of strict religious like the strict morality, as opposed to like the erotic treatise that Ibn Hazm comes up with. But Ibn Hazm is very principled in why he decides to discuss love. He didn't just he didn't just arbitrarily, he actually thought it through, and he decided, you know what, I have to write something about love, about dunyawi love, like actual love in the creation amongst people. And he gives two reasons, yeah? So it's like, why should he discuss it? Ibn Taymiyyah says, no use discussing it, we will discuss love of Allah. But Ibn Hazm's like, obviously before Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Hazm's like, no, it's really important for me to discuss the importance of love. And this is why he says it. He says it because love is the ultimate experience in the dunya. It's a gift bestowed upon humanity by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? That's what he says. So like you hear ulama sometimes and sheikhs in the khutbah, I've heard it, they talk about like the like sexual experience as the height of experience. So we've all heard that, yeah? It's like given to humanity to like, understand what the highest level of ecstasy is like, right? He's not talking about that. He's talking about like connection, human to human connection, and like romance. He's saying that is actually the highest experience. So not just a purely physical thing, which is interesting as well, right? That gives me an insight into who he is. Because he does mention like sexual relationships, physical relationships, but it's always secondary to the greater connection, yeah? And then he says that not only is love like this ultimate experience, so it should be something discussed. Like, why wouldn't you discuss the most profound thing that happens on the dunya? That's his first point. His second is, it's also the cause of demise for many otherwise great Muslims, like many of the great Muslims. People who were the top scholars, top qadis, top, the real top people of the time, the creme de la creme of the Islamic world, it was their downfall. Anyone can succumb to temptation of a beloved. So he's like, someone needs to give a guide for people who are in this state. Yeah. And he lays out the need to kind of have an explanation of love, the rules of nikah and contracts and so forth, and what the obligations are. He then talks about the different stages of love. And yeah, it's based on his own experience of like being in love with someone when he was like 16, You know, the famous story about him and the slave girl. And he talks about other disappointments in his life with regards to love as well. So yeah, that's true. That is part of his life, but it's even that is for like somewhat pragmatic reasons.
Yeah, of course.
Like we need to get this out, and he actually offers some really interesting insights into love in general. I may be going to them briefly, because I don't want to go for too long. But yeah, inshallah, I'll try and make it succinct, more succinct than I have in my notes anyway. So he basically describes 5 degrees of love. So there are 5 stages, not 40 rules, 5 stages, yeah?
Concise.
He's pretty quick. So the first one is istihsan.
Yeah.
So you've probably heard that word before, right?
Yeah.
Istihsan. So it's like, I think it's used in fiqh as well. So it basically means approval. So it's like, it's good. You know? And it's like when you see someone, our imagination represents that person as a beautiful thing or reminds us of their moral qualities as good. This is the first degree love has, and it's in common with friendship. So yeah, it's like, you know, when you say like, oh, I love that person, even for this, like if you say something like, I love that person for the sake of Allah, like that's sort of like istihsan. So it's like you affirm the person's lovable. The second stage is where it sort of gets into like a crush maybe. Let's call it crush, yeah. So stage 1 is just like acceptance or approval. The second is like, I think the word in Arabic is ijab, right? So I think it's described as admiration or wonder. So it's like when you find pleasure in looking at a person that you love or in being near them or him or her. So like that's like a crush maybe.
Yeah.
So he says that's the second stage. And then the third stage is ulfa, I think, which is like affinity, familiarity, which is like when you feel when you feel so strongly about someone or you've connected with someone and you feel a sadness when they're not there.
Ooh.
Yeah, so that's stage 3.
Very interesting.
Stage 4 is either, it's called kalaf, right? If it's like sort of more platonic, or ishq if it's like sexual, I guess.
Yeah.
And it's like when the lover is dominated by the preoccupation or fixed idea of the beloved. In sexual love, this is called passion or ishq, right? So he says that's the next stage. So after feeling sad when the person's not there, then you become like more obsessed. And the fifth one, and I actually don't think everyone gets this stage. Genuinely, I don't think everyone gets to this stage. But it's called, it's like described, I think in Arabic the word is shaghaf. So it's like amorous madness. So it's like when you go mad, like Layla and like Majnoon type, right?
Yeah.
Which is like a loss of sleep and appetite for food and drink, or becoming ill, or becoming just completely ecstatic. So he literally says, Ibn Hazm, speaking to oneself like a madman. And I don't know if this happened before, or even dying of love.
Anyone in the audience has experienced that, let us know.
Anyone who's died of love, yeah.
But I think it's very, I don't know, like, do you think that's a very specific temperamental, potentially, like extreme maybe sanguine?
That's what I mean. Yeah.
Because I can't envision like the other temperaments going into that sort of state. I can imagine like a sanguine maybe in like a very extreme version.
Yeah, no, that's exactly how I feel, man. I genuinely don't think that. That's why I said before, I don't think everyone can have that experience of love. Like if you try to explain dying of love or speaking to oneself as a madman or being ecstatic or losing sleep and appetite over someone of the opposite gender, or I guess same gender if you're into that. No judgments here. Then like people would just be like, what are you talking about? No, that's not true. And we were talking before actually like about differences between men and women, yeah, and feminism and Islamic feminism. So Ibn Hazm actually has a debate or like a response to someone in the context of a sheikh who basically says in Islam, right? His name is given as al-jahiz, but I'm pretty sure jahiz is like not a good word in Arabic. Anyway, Ibn Hazm refutes al-jahiz, right, about differences between men and women when it comes to seduction. So al-jahiz says that men can resist a woman's seduction, but women can't resist a man's seduction. And first of all, I'm reading that, I'm like, whoa, like that's different to our imaginations in Western society, right? Like that's like flipped around, because in our society, it's like men are weak to the gaze of women.
Yeah.
But al-jahiz was like, no, women are weak to men and men's like appeal. And so obviously Ibn Hazm disagrees. He's like, nah, men and women are equal in this. And he's like, I often hear people say that complete subjugation of passion is only something that men can do. So like complete subjugation of love, and not among women. But he's like, I never cease to wonder at such an idea. So he's basically like, well, that's stupid. My unwavering opinion is that both men and women are equal in their inclination towards lust and slander. The man does not exist who, when faced by a pretty woman who insistently offers him love, will not fall into shaitan's nets and will not be seduced by sin, excited by desire, or led astray by lust. As there is no woman who, if invited by a man in the same characteristics, will not surrender to him. And he's like, this is like an absolute law and a sentence which offers no alternative. So he's like, nah, it's no doubt men and women in the same boat when it comes to love. Yeah. So yeah, I thought that the reason that struck me was because it's like the debate here is about, are women seen as like beings that are more kind of subject to sort of like male attraction, or being attracted to males, or the other way around? Was my conception wrong, or am I genuinely like just espousing what I feel is like the predominant idea that it's men who are weak for like women's?
I think it's more boiled down to temperamental than specifically gender based, right?
Do you think
like,
so?
Yeah, like with a sanguine female and a sanguine male, it's gonna manifest very similarly, right? In their expression, or how they view love, or the obsession that is attached to it, right? So I think it's more so temperamental. So I think Ibn Hazm is like more correct in that kind of in his sort of thoughts there. It aligns a bit more. But just to go back to like the stages of love, how about the stage of them, the other person reciprocating or sort of fulfilling your love language? Wouldn't that be another like layer to love, in the sense that, okay, there is that physical attraction, there's that sort of aura when you're around them and you have those feelings, and it's like, you know, I want to be with them, but then it's like when they're not there, that obsession for them increases. But then I feel like there's another stage where it's like, if they really hit home in terms of, because everyone has like a specific love language, right? And it's like, if that person that you really like or in love with reciprocates it very well, I think that's another height of love.
He actually
as well.
talks about reciprocation, man. Like he actually does. So he says like about reciprocated love, and he gets. This is okay. Now I see why the Orientalists sometimes were like, this guy's a flowery poet boy. Fell in love. Because some of these sentences, he's like, neither the appearance of the foliage on plants after rainfall, nor the brightness of the flowers after the passing of water-laden clouds in the warm season, nor the murmur of waters that run beneath flowering branches, nor the beauty of white palaces surrounded by green gardens. Bro, this is poetry slam stuff. Ibn Hazm's killing it, man. Look at this. He goes, none of that is better than union with the beloved. And he's not talking about God again. Like, this is not a Sufi metaphor. Like, he's legit talking about that. So he goes, when her virtues satisfy you, and you praise her natural gifts, and her qualities are matched in beauty. So yeah, he's saying like, he talks about how in this connection, hearts are stunned before it, and the intellect is enraptured. And it's something that even the masters of grammar and rhetoric and the poets cannot express. Not even the most eloquent oratory. So yeah, he talks about the height of experience, like I said. So like they're the stages of like, maybe we should describe it like the stages of infatuation, because it's not like love per se. It's more like how you feel about someone. But then he talks about this experience, the height of experience being the reciprocation of that and the like fulfillment of that. Like I feel like when he says, when you're in union with the beloved, wasl habib, and when her virtues satisfy you and you praise her natural gifts. So isn't that sort of implying like love languages in a way? It's like their virtues that satisfy you in so much as like their specific virtues, and like maybe someone's wouldn't.
Sure if maybe in that specific context, like love languages was a part of how they view virtues, but I'm not. I don't know.
Yeah, because it like implies a sort of. I feel like it implies like the fact that not everyone will be satisfied by the same virtues. It's like when their virtues satisfy you, that's when you feel like this when you have this union and like this
that's a good point actually.
This kind of, it's like an orchestra, like it works in tandem, everything's like flowing really nicely.
Because there's also so many dynamics, like in terms of one person's chemistry with another person, the energy that you feel or sense when you're around them, or it might not be the exact same with another person, but then you respect, for example, they're more, you know, idealistic or principle based compared to one you just have like chemistry with, and it's more, you know, I don't know, touch based sort of chemistry. So there's so many like different like dynamics and potential situations that occur within love, or how it manifests differently for different people. Or if you're in love, because at the end of the day, like even Ibn Hazm said, like, well, was it 3 or 4 people he fell in love with?
He talks about like he never forgets who he fell in love. Like he feels it really deeply, but he doesn't fall in love easily. That's what he says, kind of like he's like, oh no, like it wasn't anyone, and I think he points to 3 times in his life.
Yeah, I think like a lot of people similar boat, right? Especially like in the context that we live in the West, or even just like getting to know someone for marriage, it doesn't work out. You know, people experience love in a different way. And I guess it's really hard to just kind of boil it down to X, Y, Z, because it can manifest very, very differently through different ways in terms of how you appreciate the person or how you value their strengths and weaknesses, as well as them sort of fulfilling your love language in that effect, or the sort of chemistry or aura that you have when you're with them. Some people it just clicks as if you knew them your whole life. Some people it's not that similar. It's not the exact same, but it's still that love kind of, I don't know, it's different in both situations, but I'd still call it love, right? Especially if you feel something, you have that attraction. So I think like love can be experienced differently with different people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think so too. Are you talking about the same person having different experiences with different people, or are you talking about like how everyone's experience of being in love with another person
that's
is different?
Also a possibility, right?
Yeah, that's true. I'm just thinking about that. Like, you can. Are you saying like you can love different things about a person and have a different dynamic of love and expression? Yeah. That's true, man. That's quite interesting. What would you say are the like major differences then? Like, what sort of examples are you actually referring to?
So, okay, so they can. Let's just use 2 examples, right? One of them, you may be similar temperament to them, right? And so let's just say they can be very words of affirmation or touch based, right? And you can be similarly like that. So you might have that level of attraction. Maybe, you know, they're pretty and, you know, good looking, etc. And you already have that chemistry because when you hang with them, naturally how they view love is through words of affirmation, right? And so since your love language is words of affirmation, it already like clicks, and there's already chemistry. Like if you're that kind of energy, or you're, you know, sort of life of the party, you have that natural chemistry, it can really be almost like inclined towards a physical sort of based way of love, because you can be words of affirmation, you can have a secondary, which is, you know, touch, for example, right? And so that's like one way of like seeing that love. It's like that chemistry, that physical, that words of affirmation. It's like, oh, they're reciprocating what I see or how I view love. And it's like, especially like we know in, you know, so basically, just to give context, like we haven't been recording obviously for some time, and in that, because we had lockdown here, but in that meantime we did some classes on the 4 temperaments, right? With select few people, sorry to the audience, but more close friends. And so one of the things that we talked about, which is written in Gary Chapman's book, is a love tank, right? So the love tank is like, see it as like a petrol tank, right? You know, when you have a low petrol tank, you go to the petrol station, you fill it up, right? So let's just view love tank in a similar way. Like people have a love tank in them, and it can be low because no one gave them the sort of, love language, or sort of express love through that person's love language, and hence why the love tank is low, right? We've talked about this with the episode with Noreen anyway, so people are probably familiar with the concept. So in this context, especially if your love tank is low and you never really received love through your love language, it's like in that experience, in that specific situation, if you have someone speaking your love language you're already attracted to, you're already going to feel a level of love, right? Like it's going to be really good. But then there's the other side, because, for example, that specific person you have chemistry with may not be, for example, principled, may not be as idealistic, or have those kind of ambitions and drive that you respect, but you don't maybe value as highly in that moment. Yeah. And so when you meet someone else,
maybe you share the same vices as well.
Yeah, exactly. It could be like very similar kind of personality traits, right? So then let's just say it doesn't work out with that person. And so now you view someone like, for example, you see someone that's driven, idealistic, principled. You can see like they have like they're the type of person to have like the household in check, you know, I don't know, very disciplined, raise a family well. And even, you know, there'll be that level of connection and traction to them. It's like, wow, like, I see like something here that I don't have. I know that I don't have naturally. And so naturally you also respect and learn to love them. It obviously won't be in the exact same manner as the first example, but it'll be a different kind, right? And so if that second person is able to even, to be honest, I don't think, like, depending on how balanced the person is, that second person will maybe find it a bit harder unless they're really, you know, balanced and understand psychology and, you know, understand the love language as well. They can kind of speak to your love language, right? Especially like if it could be words of affirmation, whatever it is.
Yeah, but if you're in a relationship as well, like, you should seek to understand that about the other person that you're with too. Like, there's really no excuse for adults to like not make any effort to kind of be balanced in that way. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, you have to always try to, you know, fulfill the emotional needs of your partner, right? So essentially in that context, it's like you're respecting them more in the second example, right? And you see that, and then you value them, and then you'll love them, and you learn to like, because especially with Gary Chapman, he's like, love is a verb. It's like, it's a doing thing as well. It's not like something you just kind of sit on and it just happens, right? You can kind of, if you want to love, you can love, right? And especially if the person is, so for example, if you speak to your person's to your partner's love language, right? It's like you making that effort to do it, even though you may not receive it through your love language. If they feel that love, they will try to do it for you, because it's like, oh wow, I'm feeling the love now. And so I'm reading like Gary Chapman's other books, like there's the singles version and stuff like that. He uses it in the context of you know, parent dynamics and stuff like that as well, especially with children as well. It's like people are just kind of sitting on it, waiting for this thing called love to just pop out of the blue and kind of drive them to do it. It's not going to work like that. It's like it's a verb. It's a doing thing. You have to go out and love. And so, you know, that's how he gives examples of, you know, kids that repaired relationships with their parents because they've gone out of their way to express their love, especially with the love language. Like, to give a brief summary, like, you know, quality time, acts of service, touch, words of affirmation, and gift giving. There's 5, yeah? And so if you know your parents, for example, love language, you can speak to them in that manner, more than likely they'll like, you know, be like, whoa, wow, you know, and then they will make efforts. Or even if you understand the love languages, you can see, like, even though they may not hit home with your own love language, you can see and appreciate the effort that they're actually making in order to love you, if that makes sense. So even from that perspective of being self-aware about the love languages, even if the person that you're giving love isn't giving it back to you in your own love language, you can still appreciate the fact that they're trying. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So anyways, I don't know, it's kind of relates to Ibn Hazm, but I'm just saying, like, essentially,
it's true.
In terms of different kinds of love, or experiencing that love, right? It's there, and it's not just like one thing that you can, I don't know, just say this is love and that's it. It can manifest differently and come about differently with different people. Because at the end of the day, there's different people you have chemistry with. Naturally, there's people that you really respect the qualities and values, and I don't know, it just manifests a bit differently for different people as well.
It's really interesting you mentioned that, because he talks about, like, you know how you mentioned like different types of love, right? Yeah. He actually responds to that statement. People say, oh, well, there's different types of love. There's love of God. There's love of your friends. And then even within romantic love, there's stages of romantic love, and then different manifestations of that romantic partnership. Like you mentioned, one that is where, you know, you just vibe with someone straight away, and it's like you hit it off with the person and you guys have a lot in common. Maybe you share the same temperament, you share a lot of the same interests and passions, and that really excites you, yeah? Or you have that more like pragmatic dynamic where you admire something that they have that you always wanted to have but didn't have, you know, like maybe they're just a boss, like they're just super organized, and you weren't like
and
that.
And you're like more quiet, reserved.
Yeah, exactly. See what I mean? Like that, yeah. There's that. But he actually responds to that. You know what he says? He goes, love is actually all of one type. so yeah, Ibn Hazm refutes
see this.
Its definition is this: it is the desire for the beloved, aversion to his or her opposite, and the desire for your love to be reciprocated. Interesting, right? That's interesting. So he's saying that love has to be reciprocated, right? And then he's like, many assume that in love there are different types because of its various purposes, which differ because of the range of our desires as well as its increase, decrease, or its completion. I'll leave that to the imagination as to what the completion means. There is love of God, al-muhabba lillah, the love of having certain requests granted, love for the father, son, family, friend, the sovereign, for the pleasures of the bed, for the benefactor, for what is expected or what is passionately desired. But they are all the same kind of love, though their classes vary on the desire we have for the loved one.
Okay, that was a lot.
So he's just saying, I think.
Summarize for us.
Yeah, he's saying that, no, love is all one type, but it's more useful to categorize. I think it's quite an interesting scholarly love section, because he's basically just saying like, well, what is love? What is love? He's like, it's desire for the beloved and the desire for love to be reciprocated. Yeah, desire for the beloved or the beloved, aversion to their opposite. I don't fully understand. I think it means like, yeah, you want that person's like approval, attention, or reciprocation, right? And you don't like the opposite of that.
Would you say that in terms of loving Allah, that's essentially like not the essence? So I guess the reason for that is that we seek approval and we want to, be granted Jannah, and that's a way to, I guess, that's work towards. And so we have to foster. I don't even know if I'm making sense. So we're trying to foster that love for Allah, right? Because we want to seek approval. And would you say that in terms of like people to people basis, it's like a similar thing where it's like the fact that, for example, we're married to someone or we love someone, it's like we want their approval as well. Mm-hmm. Is that what you... Mm-hmm. So is he trying to make that connection that it's like, it's all a similar type of...
Yeah, it's all the same thing in and of itself. Like it's the desire to have reciprocation. But I think like, in terms of love of Allah, muhabba lillah, he says, he also says like love of having certain requests granted as well. So you can love to have something given to you. It's all like for the same, like it's all like you want that thing, right? And you want your feeling to be reciprocated. But like, like for example, with the divine, it's necessarily reciprocated, isn't it? The idea that, for example, you have that introspection and you recall the fact that the eyesight that you have cannot be repaid by anything that you do by action. Like it's a blessing that's been bestowed upon you, right? Yeah. So like you can't reciprocate what has been bestowed upon you. Yeah. Yes. So it's like what you give to the divine has already been reciprocated manyfold in a way, right? It's already been given. So I think in that sense, like you can't really talk about reciprocation so much. But when it comes to like wanting something, like, yeah, you want something or you want proximity to the divine. When you love the divine, you want proximity to the divine, and then you hate the opposite of that. So you hate distance from the divine. Likewise, when you love a sovereign or you love your political rulers, when you do though, like you hate the opposite of them. You hate their opponents. You hate the opposition. If you love liberalism, you hate conservatism. Yeah. And you desire like a proximity and a union and a reciprocation from that. Like it loves you and you love them. But he talks about that. So he's like, that's what love is. It's that want for reciprocation, and that and the despising of the opposite of that. So he then just says, like he's basically ultimately saying it's all the same, but there's different classes and degrees. So you might say it's a different kind of love, but really it's just a different amount of that thing. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. But you're still like, you need to have the object in line. It's interesting too, like when he talks about this, so he talks about beauty, because love and beauty are connected, right? So he says, the most beautiful person he ever knew was his friend, a mate. Ibn al-Tabuni. How nice is that, man? The bromance always wins out, right? According to Ibn Hazm. He goes like, there are certain characteristics that he finds to be like the most beautiful, yeah? So he says, there's like comeliness, which is like neatness, for example, chastity, discretion, education, intellect, loyalty, purity, nobility, honesty, piety, knowledge of the Quran and Sunnah, grammar, being a good speaker. Like these are all beautiful things, right? And then he says there's also external beauty as well. Yeah. So like there's like beautiful qualities, and then there's external beauty. And he's interesting because, you know, like in contemporary discussions about attraction and love, there's the idea of like, oh, beautiful on the inside versus beautiful on the outside. Yeah. He legit says like people who possess beauty on the external, generally like they may manifest a coldness or a lack of other qualities, because it's like you've been able to have sufficient beauty manifest into the world by just your external that you never think of perfecting the internal, right? Yeah. And then he's like the total perfection of both, so inward and outward beauty is rare. But again, like he talks about it in terms of, whilst he said like the most beautiful person altogether that he saw was his mate, because beauty included the internal and the external. But like he's saying that he does say that the external, so in the debate of inward versus outward beauty, he does say that external beauty is lower than internal beauty, like values basically is most important. But he does say the greatest experience of beauty is like when, for example, a man sees a woman, and he literally says, when you see her, you will not be able to set a limit for her eyes, for her beauty is always growing and inexhaustible. And I think that was really interesting too in terms of the debate and discussion around love, right? Because do you think, and maybe we can add to Ibn Hazm here, do you not think that the emphasis on internal or external and the highest level of perceived beauty would depend on an individual's character, in so much as someone might value one over the other based on their temperament or character?
Sorry, I think I'm going to answer that, but let me know if I misunderstood what you're saying. But you know, the whole idea, people are like, oh, they might be great, but then it's like there's a sort of personality aspect to them that's ugly, that essentially it manifests on the external.
Yeah,
you get what I'm saying?
No, he talks about that. He actually talks about that. Like coldness and things like that within, like he says that people with a beauty, an external beauty, like in terms, he says beauty of form, so like physical symmetry, and like you see someone like nowadays in the lexicon of Southwest Sydney, oh, she's hot, oh no, he's hot, like that sort of thing. So like, but a lot, like he's saying that he sees a lot of people like that, and they have almost a coldness to them, because they've never had to foster a liveliness or an actual like beauty of essence, because their external beauty has carried them.
I think that's like, you can see that the metaphysical dimension to the universe sort of come into the physical, or manifest in the physical, almost in the sense that someone that it has a certain behavior or character that may, I guess, not be visible, but kind of manifests in a I don't know, like an energy or something that you sense, or a presence that you feel. It's really fascinating as well, right? You know what's interesting as well? It's like, even through it's maybe not related, but I was thinking about the other day, like especially like temperamentally speaking, you know how we have we had this what do you call it? I just had this instinct, or I had this feeling that this isn't right, or
I got a bad vibe. Yeah,
got a bad vibe that this is,
or like straight up,
I didn't. This doesn't sound right. There's that as well. Like this doesn't feel right, and it's really fascinating. I think like through our individual temperaments, there's that sort of internal radar in a sense that Allah is communicating through you, through your sort of way of I guess primarily perceiving.
No, that's true, man. Sometimes though, on the other hand, like I've been annoyed by people who have insisted upon like, I just don't know about that, I feel a certain type of way about that, and it's just stupid what they feel or what they think. Like for example, like someone will have an idea about Islam or Aqidah that's established. That's my interpretation within all like schools or a position in fiqh. But then they'll just be like, nah, it just doesn't seem right to me. So like people can have like for example, their like Western sensibilities influence their feeling about what's right or wrong, and like their vibe about something too. So I don't know exactly, but maybe it's different when it comes to people, is what you're saying, yeah?
Like specific individual people, yeah. In I think in the context of very interpersonal situations and events, when, like, for example, something happens and you're doing something that's really, you know, personal to you, and then you have that sort of, this doesn't feel right. Like you have this sort of kick in, or this sort of instinct that kicks in, or this thought, or that just, you know, sensing something wrong. The vibe is bad. It's really fascinating. I think that in terms of understanding like the sort of metaphysical, you know,
people have talked about
reality.
That. I think it was like Fahim Farouk from like Canada who was talking about like he was around this like Brahmin or something who was like known to be sort of, you know, like maybe I think Islamophobic or something like that. Like he was just not a very nice guy. And even though he was dressed in like the attire of like a holy man, and everyone was kind of gathering around him, like all the sort of non-Muslims were gathering around him. And he went on to say how he sensed in the guy like a darkness. And it's like when you have people who are sort of spiritually abased or you know, distant from like the nur of like the deen, you can kind of manifest like that manifests in the energy.
So I have a story like that, similar story. I'm pretty sure I mentioned in some episode a long time ago, but when actually I mentioned this, okay, I remember. Okay, so when the ex-Muslims came to UNSW, were you there with me when
was it the one I was in the panel
with Uthman Badr?
Oh no, that wasn't the one. I don't think I was.
I think it was like 2 years ago.
Yeah, I don't think I was there.
And you know Imtiaz Shams, Harris Sultan.
Yeah.
There's like
a
clique of ex-Muslims.
He's your compatriot, isn't he? He's a fellow Bengali, right?
I don't even know. But yeah, so they were like in the crowd, right? And so I was in the front with my friends, and Harris Sultan is there, and I looked at him like, this is weird darkness that I sense, right? So really, like, I can really like sense it like from his face. And then I looked to my back behind me, and that's like his mates, Harris Sultan's mates are there as well. And I'm looking at them, I'm like, I also sense a darkness from their faces too. And I genuinely, and then I asked my mate, like, hey bro, like, is it just me? I'm just literally sensing darkness. Am I like reading into it? You know how it's like almost like back projecting sort of my...
Yeah, you weren't sure if it was like your or like your pre-existing feelings about them.
Yeah. Just kind of wanting to see it right in that manner. But I swear it's just I just saw it, like it was just like very clear. It's something that I just couldn't shake off, and he agreed with me as well. So I'm just like, subhanallah, like there's something there, I guess, when it comes to the reality of the universe, or denying truth, or a sort of ugliness to a personality or a person that really does manifest on the external. And I really like truly believe that I've experienced it, I guess, firsthand. And especially when it comes to pious men, I think essentially, I think the term is called firasa, in the sense that, for example, I know in the instance of the Sirites, from memory, the Jewish scholar that converted to Islam was Abdullah bin Salam, I think, from memory. Yeah. And when Rasulullah when he came to Medina, you know, I think his first khutbah in Medina was, make sure you pray, you know, tahajjud at night and you'll be successful, something along those lines. And at that time, what happened was, because there was a lot of change happening in the sense of the Ansar, you know, giving, I guess, leadership to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and now Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is, you know, the head of Medina, and there was a sense of weird kind of excitement as well amongst the Jewish people, because it's new things are happening. It's, you know, curious what's going to happen now. And so Abdullah bin Salam goes to where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam came, and he knew from his face, because it's like people say, oh, is this, you know, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that we're waiting for, right? And so he looks at him, he's like, this cannot be a face of a liar, and he just converted, right? Like subhanallah, like we know many instances of that. Like this, even like people that denied, you know, the mushriks of Mecca at that time, they still knew he was like not a liar, and they knew all those characteristics, but they still denied, and hence why, you know, they died in their sort of disbelief, right? And in saying that, it's like you can see many instances like that in the seerah. You just see Rasulullah Sallallahu face, shining brighter than the full moon, for example. Like, this is things that happen or occur, right, or come to the surface of a pious, like, obviously, like Rasulullah is the most praised, and the one that we should be looking up to the most out of anyone else in the universe. So he's that role model for all of us, right? And so naturally he will embody these kind of metaphysical sort of realities, in the sense that obviously we weren't there to like experience it, but it did manifest from the descriptions we get from, especially like hadith that we read, etc. So it's really, really fascinating that even someone like Abdullah bin Salam, from the Jewish scholars, the top of in his time, that just saw his face, didn't need to speak to him, and just converted because they knew he was a man of truth, Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So subhanallah, like that's the state, right? I guess that kind of reality we need to be aware of.
And that's like,
and I feel like that's something to do with also, I guess it's a universal thing. It is a universal thing, but it's also like a human being, how they receive that. I think there's something to also unpack in the sense that how we respond to that, because at the end of the day, that's like stimuli, right? We see that, we sense that, and we feel that, and it's like, how does that impact us? That almost like transforms us, right, on a metaphysical level that we can't really, put into maybe words. Even words can't describe that, like subhanallah, about someone just by looking at their face. So.
Do you think that vibe can be translated to all people, or is it only like the very good and the very bad that ordinary people can see? In so much as like, can you tell the hal or like the state of an individual through? You can't really, like, I don't think, like, you can't actually discern someone's state or like an ordinary person's state or capacity. You can only really discern someone who's like of immense like spiritual magnitude or is like evil, right?
I think there is, I think so. You
can tell like either end of the spectrum, but it's hard to tell in the middle unless you have like that specific gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of firasa, right?
Yeah.
But it's interesting. I wonder if, I was going to ask you, do you think like when it comes to like choosing friends or choosing partners, there's any kind of inbuilt fitri kind of ability there to discern someone's energy quickly or not?
I think purely from a temperamental perspective, there's that chemistry and vibe.
Based on what we were saying about like the vibe.
I think there is that, and I think that is I wouldn't say that's like the hard and fast rule, but it's something that I would see as a positive, in the sense that if you're able to have a natural connection and chemistry with someone, it's a good sign. But obviously, like you do due diligence. But I think that is because there's even hadith. Like for example, it's like the souls. It's, I think, actually I might pull it up, but it's something to the effect of like souls being next to each other before creation, and that's how people. Sometimes you meet someone, it's like, I've known you my whole life. One of the explanations and reasons through the hadith is because in our past time, souls were created next to each other, and we actually, mixed and talked to each other before we were actually born. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so there's that really interesting explanation as well.
So you feel like the idea of a soulmate kind of has an Islamic equivalent, and there's a kind of metaphysical knowledge of a person or vibe you can get from a person when you meet them, like either in a friend or dating concept.
But obviously, like I haven't looked into it in the scholarship, Islamic scholarship, but there is that.
Yeah, I don't see why not.
I think there is definitely a basis on that, but I think there's definitely a basis for that, and something to really, it's really interesting. It's that kind of meta, physical or that spiritual sort of dimension to how we, go about life or doing things as well.
Yeah, exactly. There is, and I think it's something often neglected in the Muslim tradition. I think obviously with the like materialization of a lot of the deen, there's a sort of emphasis away from these metaphysical fitri senses that we're imbibed with, like that kind of sixth sense, more or less. And I feel it's unfortunate because it would help a lot of people. How much people pay for, like, for example, things like dating advice or dating apps, and like how difficult it is for certain people to know whether someone's good. Like in my own experience, I've had people brothers ask me, and I know my wife has had women ask her about like, just how do you know whether someone is like good or not based on like, because if you do things like proper halal, right, it's not easy to get an understanding. So I guess where my line of questioning is coming from is there a way to sense that if you can't, because bro, think about it, yeah? You want to get married to someone, okay? Or your daughter or your son or your sister or brother want to get married to someone. And you're in a position where you kind of have to be responsible in a way, either for yourself or for the person who you're the mahram of in this case, yeah? Okay, so this individual wants to get to know someone, they get to know someone. Is there any kind of way that you can have a foolproof line of questioning? Because you can't be around that person all the time. You obviously can't get to know that person before you make that commitment necessarily in Islam. Like, it's hard, right? Because we have like the idea of khalwa, like being prohibited, like seclusion being prohibited, the idea of, the mahram ought to be present, things like this. And in that case, I've known how it's easy for people to mask who they really are in like the dating / courting, the halal dating / courting scene. Yeah, and then when you're in that relationship, like the switch, like there's the flick of a switch.
I think it's just down to knowledge, right? I think if you just understand, so for example, 4 temperaments or even narcissism, if you don't want to learn about 4 temperaments because you're skeptical or whatever, even just understanding what narcissism is and accumulating that knowledge, I think it will just go a long way. Honestly, I think that sort of knowledge is invaluable, especially in this day and age. Because I guess in this day and age, it's a bit easier to mask who you really are because we live in very, isolated sort of situation, context, in the sense that you can kind of live on your own and no one knows too much about you and go about society. Whereas I assume, in the olden days or in the past, it was a lot more, bigger families, more interconnected communities, and more. Yeah, so it's a lot more, communication, and everyone knew each other, neighbors knew each other. No one knows their neighbors nowadays, So like, I think now it's like, as much as ever, it's like, it's important to have that understanding and that knowledge and accumulating that knowledge and people's behaviors and psychology. I think coupled with, obviously, if they're, following Islamic, principles and ideals, or even in terms of how someone is following Islam, it's like from their own sort of temperament, it's like they're fulfilling certain actions within Islam, but it's like from your own perspective, you're thinking, why aren't they doing this, but then they are following Islam, but through their own sort of perspective, which is a bit different, but it wouldn't come across as like, oh, they're following kind of Islam in the way that you perceive it to be. So I don't know, it's a very multifaceted conversation, but I think just to boil it down simply, like knowledge. And it's not something that, it's really weird because it's not like you just study fiqh, hadith, and somehow you just figure it out. It's not like that. And I think that's the problem, right? People think that Islamic knowledge is all there is and that's it. Islamic knowledge in this context being specifically like ilmi, knowledge, which is obviously very important. You have to, right? Learning your Arabic, your fiqh, your hadith, aqidah, etc., right? Like, no doubt about that. We have to learn it. But that doesn't stop there, right? That's not learning. And I would make Islamic learning very wide. Like, it's a very broad definition. It would encapsulate like sciences or different sciences. Could encapsulate like, it will encapsulate politics, social sciences, all these, psychology, incorporating that. Like, it's very diverse and it's very broad, right? And so within that, it's important to understand people's behaviors and psychologies and accumulating knowledge and disseminating within our communities. And so I think from that angle, you can actually pick up very specific behaviors and way people behave in a certain context and figure out, that, not to say that you're sort of the judge of what's good and bad. We don't want to go down that route, but just to give ourselves the best opportunity to understand, wait, is this the right person? Are they, the behaviors, am I just glossing over because I'm not detail oriented? Because a lot of people aren't detail oriented, right? They don't pick up specific behaviors of people. They just assume the best, right?
And they're enthusiastic and, they're like caught up in it all. And they're just,
going off that, just the vibe and that's it, right? But then people can kind of put that mask on and, give that perception of themselves, and you have to kind of pick up on different behaviors that they may be doing.
It's not hard either, is it? I was talking to my brother-in-law about like driving tests, right? And how many terrible drivers are there on the road? Like just terrible drivers. And it's like, well, how do you pass the driving test? And it's like, well, literally to pass the driving test, you just don't make a mistake for 20 minutes. And then you're allowed to drive in any condition for the rest of your life, unless you lose your license. But like oftentimes it might be too late then because you've crashed and caused some catastrophe, yeah, because you just weren't prepared or you just weren't a good enough driver. But like, it's the same thing. If you want to screen someone's personality, it's so easy just to not be terrible for 20 minutes, right? Yeah. Even if they're a terrible person. How hard is it?
Yeah.
Like, it's the same thing, right? So what I actually like, if you listen to nothing else that I've said today, I would completely understand because I talk a lot of garbage. But there is one thing that not me, but Ibn Hazm has to say about this. I've been keen to drop this. He sort of sheds some light on, I think, how to discern the truthfulness and the sincerity of someone. Because I think that what he describes is very hard to fake.
Okay.
At the beginning of his like book on ethics, yeah, I think it's Kitab al-Akhlaq wal-Siyar. He talks about temperamental excess. Like I said, he talks about the 4 temperaments and temperamental excess. But the whole beginning of it is him describing his own battles with himself. So I actually wondered, like I genuinely wondered, bro, is this guy, because when I read that thing about him like being very sort of staunch about the way he treated other people about when he thought he was right, I literally thought, I'm like, does this guy have narcissistic tendencies? I don't think it's unreasonable to have thought that based on that alone. But then I read this and then I thought, no, like he definitely isn't, because I don't think a narcissist could do this. So what I actually tend to think about is like how someone expresses their own battles with themselves, how someone is honest about how they're overcoming their temperamental vices and their perception of their temperamental vices.
Okay. No, that's right? Spot on. Yeah, mashallah.
Yeah, this is it. So this is what he says, right? He talks about how I used to think in the beginning that the suppression of my anger and the excess of cholericness was a sign of moral bankruptcy. So he used to basically say, I didn't intend to overcome my anger because I used to think that people who tried to overcome their anger or weren't angry just didn't care about anything. Yeah. That's interesting, right? That's what he used to think. But then he realized how wrong that was. And he says, despite great inconvenience and grievous displeasure that made me almost sick, right? And he says he fought so hard against the excess of his anger that it made him sick, and that in and of itself caused him to be in like a terrible state. He says, this prevented me from being in good humor. So humor is obviously temperament, right? But then he had to overcome it with great inconvenience. So he talks about that. And then he just lays it all out on the table. My defect was my vanity. By my reason, which I was very well aware of the defects of my soul. How he fixed that is he's like, I was well aware of the defects of my soul. I made myself aware of how imperfect I am and argued with myself. He said, I argued with those defects until it succeeded in dissipating all the vanity without leaving, alhamdulillah, any trace. I ever compelled my soul to recognize the unworthiness of its being and to practice humility. He also talks about his love of prestige. And then he said that to combat that, I had to forego everything that was ambiguous in the deen, anything that was potentially prohibited, and just pursue that which was good in the deen, and to have, to compete in that. Because you know how he describes he wanted his glory. He says, rather than competing for worldly glory, I'll compete for glory in the akhirah and glory in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? He also talked about his, he had a feeling of shyness, yeah? Because he talks about how he was afraid of getting married. And he says that even the impossibility to overcome this, the imperfection of which I recognize, this caused some adverse things to happen, right? But he still overcame this. He fought hard and he overcame it. And he talks about that as well. And I think ultimately, the way that he's describing his battles with himself and the way that he is making clear the awareness of what he struggled with in his life and how, like, alhamdulillah, like he overcame it, is indicative of like a really like balanced person, mashallah.
Yeah. That was actually a really good point you brought up, and that's definitely like I 100%, million percent agree. Like if someone is open about talking about, especially their struggles and their vices and where they fall short, I think that's a very good sign. I don't see how that's a bad sign, to be honest. Unless obviously there's that excess of, there is an excess to that actually. Now that reminds me, it's like you talk about all your struggles in order to gain control of the other person, to feel sympathetic, so they're under your control. But I think that's very easy to discern very quickly if someone's doing that. Oh my gosh, I'm so bad, I'm so like terrible, I can't do this and that, I just can't, like I'm just a horrible human being, this and that,
and you have to drop it, and it's like
no, the other person has to be like, no, you're not, like, no, I'm horrible, and I just can't. Like I think if someone does that, it sometimes can be in an excess in order to gain control of the other person, right? But aside from that, I think it's very easy to kind of discern that straight away if someone is doing that. But if that doesn't happen, then yeah, like in general, I think that's, people don't naturally want to talk about their struggles and what they've, gone wrong in their life. They want to naturally have a good opinion, others have a good opinion on themselves, which isn't like a bad thing, right? And so if someone is able to be open about the struggles, it's like they're making themselves susceptible, right, to judgment of others. And the fact that they're able to do it to the person that they're saying it to is definitely like a good sign, because it means they, value them, or it means that they cherish them and trust them enough in order to say those things. And I think that's a really important thing to have. And I think, yeah, if you have that, if you just portray yourself as this, perfect human being and gets everything right, and look at me, mashallah, my accomplishments, etc., that's definitely not someone that, needs to be balanced, essentially, right? But even in saying that, we do husn al-dhan in the sense that, look, if that's a certain temperament thing in terms of someone's pride, portraying themselves in that manner, it's not like I'm going to judge them, right? I'm just going to be like, at least, alhamdulillah, I don't have, like, so that's the thing, like, at the end of the day, we do have to do husn al-dhan in the sense that, like, I'm like, alhamdulillah, like, they probably went through different experiences and different, challenges, and hence why they're acting this behavior. So for me, all I can just say is, alhamdulillah, like, I don't have that, challenge or test, because I may have failed if I was given the same things that they went through, right? So I think there's that to be taken into consideration, which I try to, and honestly, like, that's what I mean, like with the 4 temperaments, and ever since I learned it, these are the things that, instead of shaming people, who's like, why can't they just be patient? Like, why can't they just do this? Why are they so angry all the time? Like, far out, like, dumb people, far out. Why are they always pissed off? Just don't be pissed off, right? But it's not that simplistic, right? And I guess with the 4T, it's
just
able
calm
to,
down,
yeah, just calm. Why just be calm, bro? Like
my advice is just calm down. And the advice they have for you is just fire up, like, get on with it.
Yeah, but like at the end of the day, I think obviously some people don't need the 4 temperaments to understand that, but it's saying like the more deeper layers to understanding that it gets revealed. But in saying, yeah, like in terms of someone being open about their struggles, about their flaws, being open about, and because they're self-aware at the end of the day, someone doing that or saying that is self-aware, and that's a good sign. If someone is self-aware and being that, is a very, very good sign that they're emotionally intelligent as well, or at least are building that sort of trait, which is really important. In terms of, even if they're open about anger or whatever, at least they acknowledge it in a very sort of in a situation that they acknowledge that it's the issue. I think that's a
you don't have to tell everyone about your weaknesses. That's like true, but like you have to be personally aware of them. And I think as like a potential spouse, it's a good barometer of like where the person's at spiritually. Like, because humility is the most
exactly
is one of the most important things. Humility and self-awareness.
That's an amazing trait, honestly. Like, may Allah allow us to all be humble. And also self-aware. That's that's a deadly combo, bro.
I think it's the most important thing. But it's interesting because Ibn Hazm has a different take on like what the most important vices are to overcome.
Ibn Hazm's out here to refute every point.
Bro, no, but this is so interesting, right? Because you know how we talked about how he expresses his excess of yellow bile.
Yeah.
causing him. You know what he says are the greatest vices for anyone to overcome? Pride, anger, desire for fame, riches, and worldly pleasures.
Yeah, it's very like
Very
choleric
typical choleric
thing. Yeah.
Like it's not, for example, grudges is the most difficult thing to overcome, or laziness, or fear in battle. It's literally those things. So yeah, that's the importance of understanding disposition and temperament, right? As we've talked about before. And for all those who are detractors of the science, you'll find it very much grounded in the writing of the ulama. And it's the language of the ulama. It is, especially when it comes to Islamic ethics. It's very rare that you'll find detailed discussions of ethics, behavior, and temperament in Islam that did not include
virtues.
Yeah,
it's a language. The science is a language to articulate these, psychological and behaviors.
That's it.
And ulama used it because it was the language of its time. And it's once you understand the science, you'll understand. Like for me, bro, like ever since learning it, you read like different hadith, you read not just hadith, like commentary, like from scholars, and the way they wrote about it is like, wait, they're actually using the temperament language to write about it and actually articulate that. So for us, it's like when we're reading English and only English and we don't know the sort of prerequisite knowledge they had when they wrote it, it's like we're actually missing out a lot of info. Because once I learned the science, alhamdulillah, going back to these commentaries, I'm just like, whoa, like I used to read, like when I came across words like temperament, mizaj, in this literature, you didn't think twice about it. It's like, oh, temperament, you know, like,
dryness,
I'm thinking of like
wetness,
just don't think twice about it, right? Like when I play cricket, like, you know, we always say the word temperament, like you got to have a good temperament to, you know, be a batsman or whatever. We think of it as just having a good head on your shoulders, right? That's like pretty much how I sort of perceived it when I was like reading those, you know, commentaries.
Even in like common language, right? Where you tell someone to chill out, or someone's hot-headed, or you tell someone to fire up. Are they not all alluding to temperamental elements and the need to channel one in a particular time?
Yeah. Like for me, especially like Sufi literature, or even literature in terms of Quranic commentaries, I've started to just see the temperaments. Even like this is maybe we could do an episode of this one day. Like you can see instances in the seerah where it's like very clear that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I'm not talking about knew about the temperaments, but it's almost like he was hinting at it like very vividly.
The Shia tradition, so I did some research on this. The Shia tradition, not our own, but the Shia one, do say that they have hadith about the temperaments and the actual explicit reference to them.
Yeah, there's so many evidence that we know, like our scholars.
No, they actually posit that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam knew about the actual science. That's within like Shia hadith. Yeah.
I wouldn't make that claim. Like my like. It could be right or wrong, but I'm not here to make that claim because it's like Rasulullah was bestowed that next level of emotional intelligence. It's not necessary that he had to know the science per se in order to.
That's my position as well. It's more like, to point out the fact that it's like an argument made.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, okay, fair enough. Yeah. But like even like we know scholars knew ilm al-firasa. There's a famous story of Imam Ahmed from memory had to unlearn the science because he knew it too well. He knew ilm al-firasa too well. Even like claims to be made like Sahaba even knew about ilm al-firasa. Like this is like not like a secret by any stretch of the imagination. So the point is like if we know it's that embedded into our tradition, right? Especially when it comes to tib, like Islamic medicine as well. It utilizes the 4 temperaments in order to diagnose people, which is a fascinating tradition as well. It's like, you can't be a skeptic. Like, that doesn't make sense. Like, give it, it's a language to articulate this. Give it its, due respect in that sense, right? It's just kind of my...
This is really interesting, actually. I was reading an article the other day on this. I wish I had it up now to refer explicitly to it. But the summary of it was that in Islam, the centrality of the medicine side of it is actually over-explained in literature, whereas Muslims were more concerned about temperament than they were about like the medicinal treatments. It's really interesting, right? So the Greek, like it's what do you call it? Galenic medicine, yeah? Was actually not necessarily as prominent or predominant as the use of temperamental like a temperamental lens on the elements. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? Okay, so there was an article I read recently by a scholar writing on the temperaments in Islam, or the four humours in Islam, and the centrality of the four humours to Islamic medicine. And their conclusion was that the four humours were in Islamic medicine, but it was secondary to the imagination of the humours as temperament and psychology. Yeah. So what it was actually more or less referring to, it was like, I sent you a photo of it. Ibn Hindu. Was talking about it in 1,000 years ago, literally 1,000 years ago to this, to today. And in his work, it's more about treatments for a certain type of temperament illness than the bile or the phlegm causing that illness. Does that make sense?
Hasn't sunk in fully.
Okay, so
slow to react.
No. Basically, how if you're sick, I could say, okay, I know your temperament. Your illness is caused by the excess of that. Like, this is in Islamic history, that's true. But what was more the case, or like more accurate in the opinion of this scholar, was that Muslims would say, what's your temperament? Oh, okay, this is your temperament. Well, because this is your temperament, this treatment will be better for you. Whereas this treatment will not be better for you. So, for example, if someone has a melancholic temperament, a cold temperament, they wouldn't actually and they had a fever, they wouldn't actively try to cool their fever down. This is the point. And the reason was because if they cooled them down, then they believe that would lead to excessive cooling. So what they would actually do is identify the temperament, not because they believe that the illness was a result of the excess of their temperamental fluid or whatever it is, like, oh, blood. He has too much blood, that's why he's sick. He has too much phlegm, that's why he's sick. It was more like, this person is sick for whatever reason. But because their temperament is this should be the treatment. And yes, there were medicines that were used by all the temperaments, but there were some that were temperament specific because they believed that Muslim scholars, medieval Muslim scholars and doctors, you call them doctors, physicians, believed that certain treatments were reserved only for certain temperaments. Yeah.
So for example, hijama, cupping, wet and dry cupping, there's a science to it where it's according to the temperament you do which one. And so that's what I'm saying, like, in terms of, see, that's the thing, like, people think we're making these points as suddenly like anti-modern medicine. Like, no, it's like you use whatever works and you accumulate knowledge of both and use it accordingly, right? Knowledge is, the power of the believer, right? And so we know that this stuff does work and is in our tradition, so we have to marry it up with whatever research we have now and sort of do the synthesis and bring it together. So it's not really making a point against modern medicine. So I think people put us in that category.
That's weird.
But like, just really to add into the cupping point, it's like there's this like fascinating like approach to it where it's like, now I see when people are doing cupping, it's like you just do it one way to all people. But if you look at the human being as a multifaceted, multi-dimensional being, right? That everyone is unique according to their own sort of behaviors, traits, physiological makeup, etc., right? You will know then quickly, it's like the same way you treat everyone for one specific disease, it's not going to work effectively all the time, 100%. And so naturally, using the temperament lens, you can specifically tailor your sort of treatment, whatever, to that specific temperament or that specific temperamental behavior or whatnot. So I guess in the context of cupping, this existed where you have to know the knowledge of the four temperaments, because we know sang is blood, for example. Sanguine will have a different way you needed to do cupping in comparison to a melancholic. And so these things, and even you talk to people who do cupping, you can see like how the blood comes out and stuff like that. It's different for each temperament. You get what I'm saying? So hence why there's a specific way you should do cupping for each temperament. So these sort of things exist in our tradition, but then it's just absent now. Like, it's just gone. Could be resolved, colonization and the way that Islamic knowledge and I guess that materialistic outlook. But it's more to the point of digging this up, understanding the perspective, instead of like having that sort of reductionist Western mindset that our scholars weren't just got it wrong and they were backward and astaghfirullah. understand the perspective and lens and how they viewed the world. And we have to do as much as we can to understand the perspective and lens, right? Once you do that, then we have our current knowledge in this day and age, bring it all together, right? Do a fusion. So it's not like, I don't know, it's not something controversial. It's very kind of basic point, right? You understand Islam through this Islamic scholars and how they viewed it, right? Because even their cosmology of how they viewed the world is so different to how we view the world now. We're very materialistic, physical sort of based approach to how we deal with things. And we were talking to someone like very dear to us, and he was talking about how he had an issue in his he had a health problem, right? And he went to all the best specialists and doctors and everything, never went away. And then he found out that health issue, that physical health issue, was a result of trauma experienced, which is more of a spiritual thing, which we know in Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, Sustenance of the Soul, the spiritual disease may give rise to a physical one.
Yeah,
right.
And literally, Ibn Hazm said, when he was trying to suppress his anger, it made him physically sick.
Yeah.
He said physically sick, yeah.
So these things and concepts, if we understand it through the Islamic perspective and, Islam, what our Muslim scholars have said about these topics and issues, it will give us a really good understanding because it marries up. Because we know in current, psychology, right? In current psychology, it's like when you study in secular institutions, the debate, I guess, does the soul even exist is up for debate. Like, you know what I mean? Like that kind of basic foundational things that we know is true. It's like already
ideas
up
of
for
the
question.
qalb the qalb and the ruh.
Yeah. So we need to understand it from our own kind of tradition and what our tradition has to say, and go about how we do things, right? So I think that's really, really important, and it's a really important project for us to be undergoing in this day and age, because at the end of the day, Islam's the truth. Islam, we know, is the ultimate truth, and we know it's a source of salvation. We know our scholars have put immense works, especially favorite of mine or my hero of mine is like Ghazali, scholars like him, many spiritual Sufi inclined scholars as well. The way they talked about the spiritual side to the human being, or the inner dimensions of the human being, the self. Like, it's just really, really fascinating how much Islam has brought to the world. It's just subhanAllah, especially when it comes to poetry, the sort of dimension or the sort of conversation when it comes to love of God, without Islam, would we ever have these sort of even conversations, exist in our sort of world? So,
yeah, and the intellectual contributions, not even just the intellectual contributions to the world of medicine and the world of astrology and astronomy and astronomy and
the Arabic language for the Quran.
I'm thinking also the intellectual achievements of the madahib and what we managed to build in terms of legal systems and preserve, and the great output and genius that went into creating these things. Systems of ethics and of law and of jurisprudence that were so sophisticated and complex and dynamic.
Yeah, dynamic.
It leaves you awestruck. Wallah, man, that was
even psychology,
bro.
Human behavior,
theology, philosophy, kalam, all of the Christian scholars of today and the apologists of today, they keep going back to a 1,000-year-old
KCA
Muslim argument. How crazy is that? Nothing has been created that's arguably nothing has been created that's more digestible and profound than that.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Our tradition is so vast and wide,
but people don't seem to. And I think you can be forgiving. Again, we talked at the beginning of this podcast about being forgiving of people, where they come from, why they reject certain things, and why they support certain things. Right? Remember, we spoke about that. You have to be forgiving. You have to have that husna dhan. We also have to have that husna dhan for people who probably don't. They probably can't connect to the deen or to the tradition the way that they ought to, or they could.
Muslims are probably not as practicing, and then
not
never
even
really
that. Yes, but even more deep than that, colonialism and the impacts of colonialism in dismantling Islamic thought and the continuation of tradition and the dissemination of that.
Yeah.
The dismantling of orthodoxy and institutions of orthodoxy, and the creation of all these different reactionary movements that are just splitting off.
Or even like, I guess, the ramifications of capitalism and how it's structured our life to the point where it's like Islam's only like a thing that
secularism, like it's just, it belongs in your home. Like you go, you pray, but you just be a good person anyway. Like that is something that we have to understand with people, and we can't like just chastise them for their ignorance of the tradition outright. But if you do have the capacity to do so, then I think, and you are listening to us still, then I think the advice has to be to go with an open mind to your tradition. Go with an open mind to understand what the ulama were talking about when they talked about temperaments. Why did they talk about it? Why was it important to them? Why did not a single one of them turn around and be like, you know what, I think this is garbage? No, why? How many Muslim scholars do you think wrote about the 4 temperaments or the 4 humours or the elements, and in, you know, they integrated it into psychotherapy and medicine, and they were okay, I understand the medicinal thing. Perhaps there were deficiencies in the understanding of anatomy because of technological impediments, right? And a lack of technological development. Although even that can be discussed as a kind of complex question. But what is important, is the psychoanalytical and like the framework of temperaments as character and as personality, and as dictating of that, and the influence that temperament has on an individual and their dispositions, right? Why did none of the ulama criticize it? What, they were all so smart, they were all so obviously brilliant, and it would, like, as I said, I'm not talking about the physiological and the anatomical. I'm talking about, why did none of them observe that, hey, you know what, that you can't categorize people into 4 ways, there should be 16.
You know what temperament would say that? Why categorize people into 4? Specific temperament, because people are more complicated and this and that. It's like you can't boil down people to 4. But that's the point. Like, I think when people make that point as well, it's a bit more I don't know, like the lack of actually understanding what the 4 T is, because it's like 4 temperaments is about reactions and behaviors, right? Your personality is, so your reactions and behaviors are part of your personality,
but
right?
they're not your personality. They're dictated,
within your personality, according to the 4 temperaments science, there's reactions and behaviors and your character, right? That makes up your whole personality. So when we talk about 4 temperaments, it's specifically reactions and behaviors. Are you quick to react? Are you more naturally pessimistic than optimistic? Are you, inclined towards, obsession over anxiety or anger? Like, these are very reaction behavioral, traits and aspects to human being. So like, when it comes to character, it's like very specific thing. I don't know, I like apples and oranges and bananas or whatever food. And that's very like, I like maths and English and studying this, and I love fiqh, studying aqidah, etc. Right? Those are like very character things, which is...
And anyone can like them.
Yeah.
Although some of them, this is like the plot twist, I guess. I know that if I took if I gathered all of those aforementioned interests, and I took a poll of the people who were most interested in them, you would see that one temperament predominates in some over others, right? So people who are interested in sort of more pragmatic and tangible things will tend to be of a certain temperament, right? And then you'll have people who are more interested in the grey and the artistic, or maybe abstraction, belonging to certain temperaments too.
Yeah. And I think even like, for example, when it comes to understanding with the temperament framework, how you have, for example, one that is more inclined towards speaking to people and enjoying conversation, and that's their element, right? So a while back, I posted up this study on my Instagram where it was a study from Iran where they got a bunch of people and they did a language test. And then they did the same language test later, right? And within that, they categorized people into their sort of whatever temperaments they are. And they sort of worked out which temperaments, right, would incline towards excelling in learning a language, right? And it was very clear. So I didn't need to know that. I didn't need to read that study in order to know what the results would be, because from the temperament lens, right, you have how it's categorized from extroversion and introversion, right? Introversion is specifically thinking before saying, right? And extroversion is speaking before thinking. So some people can blur, like for example, in a high school, in a classroom setting, some people are naturally like, they have the teachers ask a question and go, oh, me, hands up in the air. Sorry, me. It's like they're already speaking before even thinking, right? Whereas you have people that are like, haven't put their hand up. They're already introspecting, trying to figure out the whole question in their mind, right? And then they're putting their hand up. So the person that's quick to put their hand up saying, me, 100% sure that's like a sanguine, most likely, right? And so for them, it's like when the teacher picks them, they will go through the question or how to answer that question as they're saying it out loud to the class, right? It's a bit more natural to them compared to like a phlegmatic or a melancholic. They'll try to figure out the whole question and then put their hand up so then they can just relay what they've thought through in their head already. I'll give another example, and I think I didn't mention in this class and I should have. Roller coasters, right? You'll see people that are naturally screaming and, you know, hands in the air, waving. You'll already see that external expression on an external level, right? That kind of excitement or scared or fearful, whatever. It's already externalizing straight away. It's like their body's naturally reacting in that way. Some people, they're just like already like, you know, kind of to themselves and not really screaming. They're like, oh, like it's like internal screaming in their head, but that's not manifesting on the external.
Yeah, that's incredible, man. And I've had that experience as well when I'm speaking to people, right? Where I can kind of discern whether which end of the spectrum someone is on temperamentally, just from engaging their responses to things that I'm saying. Do you know what I mean? Like if I say something and it warrants an enthusiastic response,
you can already get an idea.
You get an idea, and they get like, it provokes a really like rapid enthusiastic response. But this is the thing, people will say, okay, well then the temperament's just like an explanation of like, okay, this is the type of people that have it. But here's the clincher. You have a person who gives that enthusiastic response, and then you see that the other behaviors they have will also line up with the patterns of that temperament that you wouldn't have otherwise known. You would just categorize someone, oh, that's an enthusiastic guy.
Yeah.
But then you see he also maybe, you know, there's a few elements of his character such as like kind of haphazardness in his personal organization and belongings, right?
Yeah.
And you can, with the temperament, you'll be like, yeah, I could have expected that, you know?
Yeah.
Because of that excess, you know, the excess of, is it domowi, yeah? Is the sanguine, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, the excess of the domowi, or the predominance of the domowi temperament, right? But like you can discern that from one interaction, and then you can understand more about that person.
And you can appreciate that person for who they are.
Exactly.
Instead of like when you see something that you find that isn't, you know, I don't know, the best character trait to have, instead of like shaming them like, oh, what the heck, they're so disorganized or whatever. You appreciate the beauty in that. That's the Muslim, right? That's the Muslim and how we should be. We appreciate beauty in things I guess others may not view as beautiful, right? Because we see the world a lot deeper, and we should see and view the world a lot deeper. And so temperament gives us that tool in order to help us to see it in that sort of manner. And so going back to, I guess the point about speaking and languages and stuff, right? We have people, introversion, extroversion, right? Think before they speak or speak before they think, right? And so in the context of learning a language, we already know since the sanguine, the Demawi, and the Safrawi, which is the choleric. Maybe we should stick to Arabic language to make it more palatable for everyone, eh?
Yeah, I think people get turned off by like the
language. So I've always tried to feel like I should just like not use it and speak in like kind of...
Yeah, you can do that
secular language in the sense of like, oh, there is this archetype of a human being
because
we're inclined towards a more extroversion nature.
The Muslims use different language like synonymously. Like they talked about mizaj.
Yeah.
And then they talked about, I think there was a different word for humor. Mizaj was temperament.
Temperament.
And then there was another one for humor. But then there was also the like the difference between like different words we use, like dryness, wetness.
Yeah.
And then the actual specific Damawi, Safrawi, Balghami, and Sauda. Yeah. So like all of those different words were used interchangeably. So you can use them interchangeably. I'm sure like it would be appropriate to do so.
So yeah, so in terms of learning a language, right? Since we know Damawi and Safrawi are extroversion, are speaking before they think. Naturally, that implies that they will be more inclined towards learning a language better.
Damawis are the fastest by far. I think it's
there's that aspect as well because they're quick to,
and the quickness and the desire for interaction.
Yeah, compared to Balghami and Sauda, right?
Saudas were third. I'm pretty sure they came third, and the Balghamis were last
because they have that slowness to react. On top of that, they're more introversion than extroversion.
How come the Balghamis were slower than the Saudawis though? So how come the Flegs were slower than the Melancholics to learn the language?
I think the ability of the Sauda to analyze and understand the situation will allow them to propel them a bit more forward compared to
quickly,
phlegmatics, because the phlegmatics will be naturally slowest and more about the vibe, and so they're not detail oriented, and so that as a result will not be helping them or assisting them in terms of learning a language. But yeah, like we know through like pretty much the sanguines, they love like speaking, they love interacting, they're quick, and also they have that speak before they think. And so what do you expect? Obviously they're going to learn the language the fastest. And that study, right? When I read that study, they pretty much classified people into their temperaments, made them do the language test twice to see who got better, and it just worked out perfectly according to sanguines and cholerics and melancholics and phlegmatics. Like that was the order of how it was done. This is like a proper like paper that I read. Like it's in the
Iranians
journal,
are really into the temperaments, aren't they, man?
So it was really fascinating. Like it was really. I'm like, that's that pretty much settles it in that sense, right? So
there's not much ambiguity there about the predictive nature of a temperament in many cases, right? Yeah, that's it. Khalas.
And it's kind of like also ties in to understanding the world better, seeing people for what they are, and kind of then potentially tying it with like political kind of approaches and how we should go about doing things politically speaking.
Absolutely,
right? I think
man.
It's a very, very crucial in terms of tying psychology into politics.
It's predictive of success and failure in certain environments. So let me give you this example, whilst it's fresh on my mind, because like our mate Ibn Hazm, rahimahullah, he doesn't get along with his cousin. His cousin's name's Abu Mughira, and they used to be mates, but then one day Abu Mughira picked a fight with Ibn Hazm, and the text doesn't mention the reason, but then it says the young intellectual cousins exchanged insults, and Abu Mughira went so far as to silence Ibn Hazm. You know why? Not because of the strength of his arguments, because he was sharper and shrewder when speaking in public, according to Ibn Hayyan. So he was quicker in his responses, sharper, and he had like Ibn Hayyan mentions that he was more physically attractive, was predominant in his serious speaking, but also in his jokes as well, and had a natural inclination or a natural ability, to win the hearts of people who he was like speaking to or debating to, unlike Ibn Hazm. So you can tell there, right, how the temperament of the two people affected the outcome of the debate in the eyes of the public, and he's actually referring to it directly. He says the debate outcome didn't change because there was a discrepancy in play. The debate outcomes, the perception of that didn't change because of the discrepancy in intellectual caliber. No, it was literally because one was wittier, was sharper, was able to make the most, was predominant in serious matters and in joking, and had a tact for gaining the hearts of people. So there you go. Like from that temperamental lens, you can see the dichotomy between like maybe your choleric and melancholic, and then the sanguine in the capacity to manipulate and dominate in certain fields, right? And to have success in these environments. And that's like a lens that it enables you to understand when maybe you're discerning information. Something might be compelling to you, but then you can ask like, is the strength of this argumentation based on the person making it, its capacity to be charming or persuasive, or rather, is it the actual caliber of the argument itself? And you'll see like how debates, discussions unfold.
Agreed.
And by and large, those who have a big following and a smaller following, it has to do with those matters.
So much to unpack there in terms of understanding why, why people draw towards certain characters and how that is done and why it's done. And that's something to really like take into consideration as well, because this goes back to what I was saying earlier about our sort of unconscious behaviors, because sometimes we align or just gravitate towards a certain person because it's natural in the sense that in terms of like Islamic speaker or the way they're compelling, but it's also to just catch ourselves in the sense that, okay, instead of like just following what they're saying or kind of going towards where the energy is, it's about unpacking, take a pause and just kind of unpack, and look into sort of the holistic behaviors as well. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in the back of my mind as well, back of our minds as well. But talked a lot there, mashallah.
We did well, man. I had so much more points to say as well. Inshallah, next time, man.
What are the points?
Oh, bro, I could go for days, fam. I have.
It's a really good one. Just mention.
I have a book here that I could literally write. I think I've taken 16,000 words of notes.
Oh, subhanallah.
And organize them under subheadings. See, like I've got like a little thing here where like I can navigate it on Ibn Hazm.
So what's the most interesting, like,
bro,
we haven't talked about?
All right. Thank you for giving me the floor, Tanzim. I appreciate that. MashaAllah. And I genuinely wonder if anyone's listening to this and if anyone finds it as fascinating as I do. So like I said, I reckon the title of this episode has to have something to do with like Ibn Hazm, Latin lover boy, or lunatic literalist. Which one was he? I think he was.
That's actually a good title.
I think he's a great man. I genuinely think he's a great man. And that is coming from his mortal enemy, the Maliki, right? There was no love lost for Ibn Hazm from the Malikis, and you'll understand why. It's because Ibn Hazm was so aggressively anti-Maliki that he basically shocked the Maliki school into existence. So you know how at the very beginning when I was talking about it, I mentioned that Ibn Hazm went to the island of Majorca and he was basically picking on people by being like, oh yeah, so why do you do this? Yeah. And then they'd say, oh, well, this is what we do. It basically, the people there had only understood fiqh as much as the masail. So what the Hanafis say, for example, about a certain action. But if I said why, you wouldn't be able to answer me. Yeah. So what actually happened after that was he debated and destroyed all of the scholars in the area, because all the scholars in that area didn't know the dalil for everything. Ibn Hazm had spent time researching it. So they had to get a scholar who actually, the top Mali of the time, al-Baji, right? Who came from like overseas to come specifically there to refute Ibn Hazm. Like, can you imagine, right? Some guys tearing around Sydney, destroying all the ulama we have here. And we have to get like Qaradawi or like Didu out here to refute him specifically. Yeah. So yeah, that was really interesting. So yeah, this guy was like super anti-Maliki, and his arguments, man, his whole thing was an attack on the madhab system, right? And it's interesting because Salafis have tried to appropriate him, like I said, and modernists have tried to appropriate him. So they've tried to come out and say basically that, oh, Ibn Hazm, he should be used as a model to attack madhabism and attack the Ash'ira and the Maturidiyya because of his literalism. And the discussions around Allah is above the Allah made istiwa of his arsh and all of that. And Ibn Hazm's positions on that have come up again. But then you also see modernists saying, well, the way he just did away with tradition and some of his positions, like for example, he's the one responsible for musical instruments. Being the opinion of musical instruments being permitted. He basically says that none of the hadith that prohibit them are serious and admissible. And as such, you can't really ascribe any camp to him. You can't view him as like a appeal to like a modern post-tradition, and you can't sort of call upon him as a Salafi given the way that he sort of stands at so clearly at odds with like the Salafi ethos, like permitting music and frivolity and art and things like that. Like he's quite lenient with that kind of thing. And also like, yeah, just the way I haven't met many Salafi scholars writing prolific love treatises.
Might exist, we never know.
Inshallah, man. But yeah, so he just was very rigorous in his method, a very literalistic method. But the problem is obviously when you reject analogy and when you reject interpretation, there's going to appear to be contradictions. You know how there's certain verses in the Quran that have abrogated others, and certain aspects of the Sunnah that have abrogated verses in the Quran. So Ibn Hazm basically says you can't just say something's abrogated. You can't. That's a cheap way to get out. You have to find some way to harmonize the texts, yeah? And he says, well, his critics would say, well, you're just going to have a whole weird bunch of contradictions. And you know what? He literally turns around and says to them, well, what does contradictions matter? All that matters is if it's true. It doesn't have to make sense to you. If this is what the Quran and the Sunnah say. So, without going on for a further 15 hours, which I probably could, this guy is the most hated guy, but his points that he made about the Malikis, and this is why we respect him now, or I respect him anyway. The points that he made forced us, the Malikiya in al-Andalus, in the Maghrib, and also in Sicily, which is my homeland, and there were a whole like school of Malikis there, they forced us to go back and actually study. Like he kept us on our toes. If it weren't for his insistences and his polemics against our tradition, then we wouldn't actually have gone back, found and collated the evidences and built a stronger, more robust tradition. Do you know what I mean? So in that way, I respect him a lot. And I think that when someone has intellectual capacity, such as what he exhibits, and insights, such as that which he exhibits, it is necessary to respect that.
Definitely agreed.
Even if they were hated in their times. And like, to put it in perspective...
Bro,
like,
I think many scholars... Sorry, finish your point.
No,
I got a lot of points about this.
Yeah, go on.
No, it's just the fact that you'll be surprised that many scholars that we praise now, in their time, it was like... They were like... So one example that comes to mind straight away is al-Muhasibi, that I'm really big fan of, because we know that his works essentially set the stage for Ash'ari theology, which then set the stage, I guess, for Ghazali, that took from a lot of his works. But at that time, al-Muhasibi was condemned by, I wouldn't say condemned is the right word, but Imam Ahmed was, rahimahullah, was opposed him, because there was a few reasons, but one of the main reasons was apparently, like, I guess with the refutation of the Mu'tazila, he was al-Muhasibi would write about it a lot, and so I think within that Imam Ahmed rahimahullah thought that he's spreading too much of the Mu'tazila works in doing that, and so there's I think there's other reasons, but I think that's like the main one. But that doesn't mean like he had this whole hatred or opposition. I think his followers were the ones that kind of, perpetuated a sort of vitriolic kind of approach. And it got to the point where al-Muhasibi pretty much died with like 3 people in his janazah. Like he was like by himself, and he was known as like, I think in terms of, the Sufi tradition and what he came up with, like he was, amazing, mashallah, in his expertise. Like he was known for, zuhud and, really doing those kind of Sufi religious practices to the T, to the point where even when he was young, he didn't accept his father's inheritance. I think there was 2 reasons. And I think he came from a wealthy family as well. So he didn't even accept his inheritance from his father. I think one of the main reasons is because something to do with eating halal, or something to do with him not too much leaning towards predestination or something. I forgot the exact specifics, but he gave 2 reasons. And because of this kind of theological, kind of Islamic reason, he just didn't take inheritance from his father, which is really interesting. And so you have this person that pretty much died by himself, but then you see his works live on essentially it stand the test of time, right? And so people like him, people like Abu Zayd al-Balkhi as well, if you read in his in Sustenance of the Soul, literally in the before he actually starts the book, he alludes to how scholars of his time were sort of condemning him writing this treatises or this manual on psychology because they thought that there was better things to write about, and he actually still went ahead and did it. And once you read it, when you read Sustenance of the Soul, it reads like a modern day manual, like for this day and age, which is really like freakish, like subhanallah, like it's amazing. So there's so many like examples like this where you have, you know, scholars that sort of went against their time and sort of, you know, their work stood the test of time. And it might sound egotistical, but I find, I don't know, you can kind of maybe put this on like, I guess, like Socrates is another example. Like you can find examples of people's like work standing to the test of time, even though people may not have, you know, liked them per se. But in saying that, it's like, if you have like, I guess through Islamic perspective lens, it's like if you have the truth and you believe in what you're saying, and even people around you oppose you, I think you should have that conviction, and inshallah, you know, your works will stand the test of time. Like even what we say, what we've said on this podcast, the sort of topics we've discussed about on this show, I think a lot of people don't disagree, right? I think we get branded as like the leftist Muslim liberal podcast or whatever. Anyways, because I think we ascribe to different sciences that are not from the tradition, yada yada, right?
Like it's got nothing to do with the fact that I'm a member of the Communist Party, right? Like that's got nothing to do with my politics.
But like
that was just my dad.
You have this sort of labels thrown at us, right? Which I don't really care now, but it's like once you take the time, and because even the people that we align with politically speaking, I don't even agree with them from the psychological perspective. We've had these debates, and so we've had this kind of discussion ourselves that we find ourselves in a unique sort of standpoint where it's like, it's not like I have someone that I full go to and just agree with everything. Like I don't think that even exists, right? There's probably one very intelligent person, mashallah, that is sort of on our wavelength that I know, but I'd say like, there are obviously like sheikhs and stuff that agree with us on, but don't understand
I wouldn't say that
fully.
Look, I think that I wouldn't go so far as to say I'm on a wavelength or position that's unique. And anything that I have, that I know, or that I've achieved, or am aware of, is from Allah.
Okay,
and
we get the humility, brother.
And anything, no, I'm dead serious.
I get that. But I'm saying but I'm saying from the perspective of people around us. I get your point. I agree with you 100%.
I get what you're saying. I'm saying
from the perspective of people around us, right? I don't feel like I fit into any sort of group per se. I'm not going to go to this mate and be like, hey, you're my leftist buddy and whatever. Because I always find with those, like even those activist
circles. Are you saying
circles,
that you're
I disagree with this
for the red pill, but too red pill for the left? Is that what you're trying to say to us, you know? You heard it here first.
It's going to go down another 2 hours if I go into that discussion.
What are we then?
Like even like within that, right? You see behaviors by certain, like even in that discussion, right? People are very, like, it's fine. Like obviously when it comes to like patriarchy and issues within society, right? You know, have a got them in. Like, I don't care. I don't know why people are so like sensitive about that. I've seen men get all annoyed or whatever when women, you know, air their frustrations about men and all that, right? But sometimes I think as well in that conversation, what gets missed is us as Muslims as well, being in the Western context, being in a society where it's like, we don't, you know, it's liberal society, I guess, right? Or in the sense that we are, you know, most Muslims are, you know, either from subcontinent, etc. We have our own specific challenges and issues and struggles, etc. It's always to, you know, have to keep in mind, regardless of, irrespective of gender, but that's something to keep in the back of our mind as well when going about society in general and life as well. But anyways, point is like sometimes that even like when it comes to men and the sort of behaviors, right? I find even when it comes to, you know, heartbreak and men, how men react to that, it's like a conversation why men have the highest levels of suicide rates, you know? These kind of like, talked about like a friend of mine suicided not too long ago as well. So like this is like a direct kind of conversation that needs to be had when it comes to men and mental health and all that sort of stuff as well. That may get missed at times, right? In certain, you know,
circles,
right? I'm not saying all circles, but it's something to keep in the back of my mind.
I guess it's important to understand the nature of the intra-community dynamics. Like, would you appreciate me coming in here and insisting that my experience as a Muslim is the same as your experience as a Muslim? Would you appreciate that?
In the sense of, what do you mean?
I don't think it would. I wouldn't appreciate that if I was you. Like, I come from a very different place. I didn't suffer the stigma of being brown.
Yeah.
I was never bullied because of that. Any remarks that were made about me being like a wog or whatever was mostly joking, and it was not from a position of like a power imbalance that brown Muslims have experienced. Like, that is an unequivocal fact, right? That I could not really suggest that my experience as a Muslim is the same as yours. But that being said, as a result, your capacity to describe your experience and articulate your experience as a brown Muslim is essential. You need that. And you don't need me coming in every time and trying to be like, yeah, no, me too, I experience things the same way. Likewise, our collective necessity to discuss issues facing the broader community, which I do also experience, should not bar me. I shouldn't be also barred from that, because I am a Muslim. I know my experience is different to yours, just like an Arab person's experience is different from an African person within the ummah. Yeah? A wealthy person's is different from a poor person's within the ummah. And there need to be discussions and like, I mean, should I use the I word, intersectional? I'm going to use it. There needs to be that kind of intersectionality. And there needs to be that level of analysis.
Yeah, of course.
But that doesn't mean that we can't all have discussions about our own respective grievances and problems and have a space for that. And I genuinely do sometimes feel that there is a sort of clique mentality that forms, where it's like, well, you can't speak about this because you're this. It's like, okay, maybe I am overspeaking, but what happens then is that if I try to speak about anything else in and of myself in my own circle, people also come there and be like, why are you speaking about this? You don't have any real problems. You're just, and I think that's what you're talking about with regards to like the male suicide and the pandemic.
Even like, what conversations are like, for example, and we've had these before in our sort of classes, where people are like, Muslim men don't have control over society at the moment, and so they sort of enforce that control over in their family, and hence why you have certain behaviors and reactions, which is true, but obviously not from a holistic perspective. But I guess within that conversation, it's really important to highlight different behaviors or temperaments of people, because to say that men are just going to be like that, that's definitely not true, because you're kind of boiling down men in a certain manner as if they're going to behave in one exact manner, because there's going to be reserved, quiet, shy people that when a lot of stress comes, they just go into a shell,
they withdraw, yeah.
So these are the multifaceted conversation that needs to be had. It's really important.
There's another dimension as well, let me quickly add. The dimension is that, yes, there are elements and there are problems that we've discussed at length about where men are sort of men oppress women in dynamics.
Yeah.
Most violence is disproportionately committed by men against women, not women against men. That's a fact.
Yeah.
So henceforth, you can see a dynamic of oppression and violence, right? However, Ibn Hazm talks about the Islamic tradition, and Ibn Hazm himself articulates this, is quite clear. There are responsibilities for a man, financial responsibilities for a man, that women do not have. Yeah. And yes, that can also lead to problems for women. It genuinely can. I'm not denying that. But you also can't deny that burden and that pressure that we feel and that men feel, and that necessity to live up to this possibly divinely mandated responsibility to be a provider, the sole provider. You can't feel like...
It's a naturally status thing, especially in this day and age, right? It's like...
But this is important. Like, this is hard, right? This is
tough.
So why is it in any way problematic for us to discuss that, the burden of that and the stress of that? And
I knew I had to go through this personally in the sense of like, especially when I started doing like part-time uni, prolonging my uni degree, doing other stuff, like the pressure that comes with that, because it's like, why aren't you got a job yet? Why aren't you doing this? Like, I had to really undergo that, and I felt like a lot to deal with mentally, in terms of it's like once you actually go to study, it's like you have these stresses that you're already sort of dealing with because of image, status, money, yada, where I should be at, right? And so on top of that, it's like that racial aspect of even being a Muslim, it becomes a challenge, right? In terms of your own experiences going about society and what you encounter, right? Or even the racism you might encounter in a workplace situation. Like there's so many dynamics that need to be like considered and sort of thought about when it comes to these discussions that probably aren't as highlighted in certain circles. And that's why like I sort of tune out as well, especially with the example I talked about, like men taking control of the, like definitely that happens, and definitely that's a big problem. And we've seen that control and that toxic behaviors from men, 100%
Yeah,
agree.
but we also suffer.
But I guess people will be like, but you're just saying
aspect,
like, oh, not all men sort of, it's
no, like that's not your point. I understand that's not your point. And it's more or less a discussion about how there are issues.
Tackling issues,
that are common to us because of our gender. And yes, it's not necessarily about women, right? We may not necessarily suffer at the hands of women the same way they do it. Like we're not physically assailed at the same kind of prevalence, right? But we suffer at the hands of the C word is coming out, guys. Capitalism. I got that. There you go. Communist confirmed. No, but we suffer at the hands of that, and we suffer with the burden. And as I said, in our tradition, in Islam, Ibn Hazm talks about it. All of the ulama talk about it. Within the madahib, there is a belief or an inclination toward the fact that a man is the financial provider.
Under capitalism,
and now,
how tough is it? How crazy are like
because exactly.
And I guess now that's why like people are propelled. Even this interesting conversation where a lot of Muslims are like, oh, why females work? We've had this conversation before, like, astaghfirullah, women are meant to work, meant to be a house while they're working. But no, bro, it's capitalism. Like you're expecting one single income household to run, like, a family or a big family. You can do it, obviously. I'm not saying you can't do it, but naturally, what do you expect in this kind of circumstances and situations, right? So it's a result of capitalism, not because all these feminists are, going crazy now and working, like weird perceptions like that. But yeah, even like that conversation about men and sort of like pressures, it's fueled by capitalism as well because of everything that's kind of going on. So these are we want to have these kind of multifaceted discussions, right? Incorporating psychology, incorporating our kind of condition, material condition, but yeah, it's sometimes difficult to have because I think one leans to one side too much and the other one leans to one side too. Like there's it's only personal responsibility, that's it. And it's like, I get what you're saying, but no, there's more factors to consider here, like chill, bro. You know what I mean?
That's it. And in that way,
the structural thing, it's like, yeah, but we should also learn to balance ourselves as human beings and understand people, and that may not be factored into the conversation.
And instead of rather describing or envisaging a hierarchical transcendence of the diapole of the red pill versus the leftist or the liberal, instead of positioning ourselves having transcended that, I think it is adequate or accurate rather to describe that we fit comfortably into neither.
Ooh. Hungry boy.
Nah, man, that's acid reflux, bro.
Oh, dang.
This European stomach isn't made for nagamuris. Those who know will know. I think we'll call it there. Yeah, we've been going for
we're going for a while.
Marathon.
It's like, what time is it now? It's midnight,
bro. I'm just getting started, bro. Like I could.
Probably have to
I warn the listeners to never ask me a question about Ibn Hazm.
Because I think that conversation has annoyed me as well, and I just can't have these conversations. Because
what's the point of having a podcast if you can't vent?
That's true. Yeah.
People listen to your venting, man.
But probably wrap it up now. But I guess to end on things like I think when it comes to especially as Muslims, and I guess that was one of our intentions, or we try to make it our intention, and also our purpose and goal when it comes to starting Boys in the Cave, is to just reflect around the world, reflect on ourselves, really understand things about Islam that you otherwise would not have kind of seen if you just kind of, go about society. And we may not do it perfect all the time, We probably never did it perfectly, but we're at least trying. And I do try to show like obviously, you know, inshallah, like I'm trying to be sincere in doing this in saying that it's like we try to be open and honest about these conversations. And I think it's really important to have these conversations because it feels that sort of level of self-awareness about situations, right? In our sort of context and even ourselves in terms of behaviors and patterns and seeing the side of Islam that you otherwise would not have maybe seen from your local masjid or whatever. So I know we've had a prolonged break. It's honestly because, you know, we've been doing this for like 3 years now, and lockdown was a bit weird, and I needed a break. A lot of things were happening, and so
don't make excuses, bro. Just overcome, bro.
Nah, I feel bad. Like, I think at the end of the day, like I think I've told this to someone, I was like, Boys in the Cave has given me much more than I guess what people think.
When are you gonna go up and become Men in the Cave, bro?
But yeah, for me, I think this podcast has like really, I think without this, I probably wouldn't be the person I am today, purely from the perspective of the amount of people I was able to get hold of and able to learn from and also research on my own because of what they said. I think there's so much that, you know, that I've learned along the way, and I'm like, inshallah, try to. Nowadays, I think we've done a few internals, but maybe it's just to kind of see what the vibe is and if the audience likes it. It's a bit more, I think, comfortable in that sense. Obviously, we'll have guests and stuff, which we've had and we'll continue to have, but it's also to do this from time to time to just kind of touch base and be honest and raw in our conversation. And so, inshallah, we'll try to do that. I'll try to make it, you know, inshallah, 2 to 3 weeks, you know, once every 2 to 3 weeks, I'll release an episode. But please, you know, send, if you have any questions or queries, you can definitely like send our messages through Instagram because I'll be active through there and reply to you all, inshallah. But we'll keep this, we'll try our best to keep this going. And so
I'll just leave everyone on a bit of advice from none other than the legendary fellow Latin brethren, a Latin brother rather, Ibn Hazm, talking about his goal in life. I was endeavoring to discover a goal which all people unanimously approve and seek, and I found that there is but one, namely the avoidance of pain. The avoidance of pain is a principle upon which are agreed all peoples since Allah created the universe. There is not in the universe since it came into existence and until it ends anyone who would like pain and would not wish to repel it from themselves. And when this lofty knowledge became clear and firmly established in my spirit, and this wonderful secret was revealed to me, I began to investigate the path by which to reach the truthful method by which to avoid pain. There is but one road to attain it, namely to work for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and anything that is contrary to this is aberration and stupidity. Do not exert your soul except in things which are on a higher plane. He who exerts his soul in purposes of this world is like unto him who buys pebbles for precious stones.